Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Horror. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video. Story 1. It was a crisp morning, perfect for a jog around the neighborhood. The streets were quiet, the sun barely rising over the rooftops, casting long shadows on the pavement. I was enjoying the calm, the rhythmic pounding of my feet against the ground, when I noticed something odd. A car had passed me, a sleek black sedan, moving slowly enough that I could hear the hum of its engine as it went by. I didn't think much of it at first, figuring it was just another car on the street. But then, a few minutes later, the same car came around again. This time it slowed even more as it approached, and the driver gave me a brief, almost too casual glance. I felt a strange chill run down my spine, but I shook it off, telling myself it was just a coincidence. People in the neighborhood drove the same routes all the time, and maybe this person was just out for a morning drive like I was out for a run. By the third time the car passed, I began to feel unsettled. It was too soon for it to be a coincidence, and the car was moving in the same pattern, looping through the streets in a way that didn't seem random. I kept running, my pace increasing, hoping that if I just kept going, the car would eventually turn off and leave me in peace. But the car stayed with me, always staying a few paces behind, as though it was keeping pace with my jog. As I rounded a corner near the park, I saw the car coming up behind me again. This time it didn't speed past like the others. It slowed down and pulled up alongside me, the window rolling down with a soft whir. I glanced over, my heart skipping a beat. The driver was a man wearing dark sunglasses despite the early hour. He had an unsettling smile on his face, one that seemed far too wide, too deliberate for someone I didn't know. "Hey there," he said, his voice smooth and casual, as if we were old friends. "Beautiful morning for a jog, huh?" I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral, though my mind was racing. "Yeah, just out getting some exercise," I replied, my voice sounding more strained than I intended. There was something about him that felt off, like a switch had flipped in the air, and I wasn't sure what to do next. The man's smile widened, and for a moment I thought he might say something else. But instead, he simply kept his eyes on me, his gaze not leaving my face. The longer I stood there, the more unnerving his silence became. It was as if he was waiting for something I wasn't sure I wanted to provide. I forced myself to take a few steps back, trying to create some distance between us. I've got to keep moving," I muttered, then turned to continue my jog. I could hear the car slowly pulling away, but I didn't dare look back to see if it was following me again. The sound of the engine faded, but it was hard to shake the feeling that it wasn't over. For the next few minutes, I tried to focus on my breathing and my pace, pushing my legs harder to make it through the remainder of my route. But no matter how fast I ran, the image of that man's smile stayed with me, his eyes lingering in my mind like a shadow. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder now and then, half expecting to see the car right behind me. I reached the end of my usual loop and turned down a quieter street, hoping to shake the feeling of being watched. But just as I passed a row of houses, I heard the distinct sound of tires on pavement. I froze. The car had returned, this time creeping up behind me slowly, just as it had before. My heart started pounding in my chest, adrenaline rushing through me as I picked up my pace, my legs moving faster than before. I reached a crosswalk and glanced both ways, hoping to find some kind of distraction, a reason to stop or even cross the street. But as I waited, the car passed me again, this time slowing to a crawl right as it reached the intersection. I could see the man behind the wheel, his face now fully visible. His smile hadn't faded, and his eyes were locked onto mine with an intensity that made my blood run cold. He didn't speak this time, but the look on his face said everything. It was like a silent challenge, as if daring me to react. I took a deep breath, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what to do. I had to keep moving. If I stopped, I wasn't sure what would happen. With one last glance over my shoulder, I forced my legs to carry me forward, down a side street I rarely used. I told myself that if I just kept running, I would be safe. But even as I sprinted, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, still watching. The sound of his car, though distant, seemed to echo in my ears. A few blocks later, I finally reached the main road again, hoping to see some people or traffic that would reassure me. But as I passed a small convenience store, I saw the same black sedan parked at the curb. The driver's side window was rolled down and the man was sitting inside, watching me from a distance. I stopped dead in my tracks. This wasn't normal. He wasn't just driving by anymore. He had been waiting for me. And now, as I stood there frozen in the middle of the sidewalk, I realized that I didn't know if he was going to speak, follow me, or worse. I took one last glance at him, my mind screaming at me to run. The smile on his face was gone, replaced by something much darker. Without thinking, I turned and ran back the way I came, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't look back this time. I couldn't. The car had stopped following me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst wasn't over yet. Story 2. I got into my Lyft late at night, the kind of night when the streets were mostly empty, and the only sounds were the occasional hum of a passing car. The driver was a middle-aged man with a thick beard, dressed in a worn-out jacket. I gave him the address, and we set off into the quiet streets. The city's lights flickered in the rearview mirror, and for a moment, I felt a sense of peace, like the weight of the day was finally lifting. A few minutes into the ride, the driver's phone rang, its ringtone sharp against the calm. He glanced at the screen before answering, his voice low as he spoke into the phone. "Yeah, I got her," he said. The words were casual enough, but something in the way he said them sent a chill down my spine. I looked out the window, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. The driver didn't say anything else for a few moments, and I tried to push the feeling aside. Maybe it was nothing, just a simple conversation with a friend or a family member. But then he spoke again, his tone suddenly colder. "She's in the car now. You're sure about this?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched for a moment before he muttered something in response. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror briefly, and I felt his gaze settle on me for a split second. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head to look out the window, trying to distract myself, but my mind was racing. Who was he talking to? What was this all about? The streetlights blurred past, casting long shadows over the sidewalk. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, but the words kept echoing in my head. I got her. I could feel the tension in the car now, the air thick with something unspoken. The driver's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, and I noticed the way his knuckles turned white. His phone call seemed to drag on, the quiet hum of his voice mixing with the faint sound of the wind outside. I felt trapped in the car, the walls of it pressing in on me as I tried to make sense of the situation. I wanted to ask him who he was talking to, what was going on, but my voice caught in my throat. My mind flashed to the last news story I'd heard about a Lyft driver being involved in something dangerous. The thought made my heart race faster, and I suddenly felt very aware of how isolated we were, driving through the dark streets. There was no one else around, no one to hear me if something went wrong. The driver's conversation shifted again, and this time his voice was lower, almost a whisper. "She doesn't know, does she?" "You're sure she doesn't know?" The words felt like a slap, and my chest tightened in fear. I leaned forward, my heart pounding in my ears. This wasn't just a casual conversation. This was something else entirely. I wanted to scream, to shout for him to stop the car, but I couldn't. My mouth felt dry, and my thoughts were too scattered to form a coherent sentence. As the car rolled through the quiet streets, I glanced around for any sign of life, any sign of safety. But the neighborhood was empty, the windows of the buildings dark. My destination seemed so far away now, like it was on another planet. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. What did he mean by "she doesn't know"? Who was he talking about? And why did I feel like I was part of something I didn't understand? My phone buzzed in my pocket, the sound of it startling me. I pulled it out quickly, hoping it was a text from a friend or family member, something to ground me. But when I looked at the screen, it was a message from Lyft. "Your driver is taking an unusually long route. Are you okay?" My stomach dropped, and the world around me suddenly felt like it was spinning. I looked out the window again, trying to gauge where we were, but nothing looked familiar. The streets seemed to blur into each other, and I couldn't tell which direction we were headed anymore. I glanced at the driver in the rearview mirror again, trying to get a read on his face, but he was focused on the road, his expression unreadable. I was about to text my location to a friend when his voice broke the silence. "We're almost there," he said, his tone suddenly friendly, too friendly. It sounded forced, like he was trying to cover something up. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and tried to act calm, even though my hands were trembling. The car slowed, turning onto a quieter street, and my heart thudded in my chest. "Where are we?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. The driver didn't answer right away, and when he did, his words were almost dismissive. "And just a little further." I could feel the cold sweat forming on my forehead as we continued down the unfamiliar street, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The car stopped at a red light, and for a moment I felt like I could breathe again. But then the phone rang once more, and the driver answered with a single word, "Done." The light turned green, and the car lurched forward. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, but I had no idea what to do. I was trapped in this car, heading to an unknown destination with a driver who was acting strangely. I had no way of knowing what was waiting for me when we arrived. The car stopped suddenly, jerking me out of my thoughts. I looked around, my stomach twisting in knots. We were parked in front of a dark building, one I didn't recognize. My mind screamed for me to get out, to run, but my body didn't move. The driver turned off the engine, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then he turned to me, his eyes cold in the dim light. "You're here," he said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I didn't get out. I couldn't. Something told me that if I did, I wouldn't be able to escape. Instead, I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and pressed the emergency button. The driver noticed, his expression hardening, but before he could say anything, a voice came from my phone speaker. "Is everything okay?" The driver didn't say a word. He just stared at me, his lips curling into a tight, unsettling smile. Story 3. I had been babysitting the Harris kids for about 3 months by then, and I had gotten used to the quiet routine. The kids were asleep upstairs, and I was sitting in the living room, watching TV and Kai and I on the clock. Their parents were out for the night, and I was expecting them back in a couple of hours. Everything seemed normal until I heard the faint sound of the front door unlocking. At first, I thought it might just be my imagination, But then I heard it again, soft, deliberate clicks of the lock being turned. I was sitting on the couch, frozen, staring at the hallway that led to the front door. I knew I had locked it when the parents left, and I was sure the deadbolt was engaged. My heart began to race as I got up slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The house was eerily still, and all I could hear was the hum of the refrigerator and my own breathing. I made my way to the door, feeling a wave of dread settle over me. As I approached, I saw the door handle slowly turn, the metal glinting in the dim light from the hallway. My stomach twisted with fear. Whoever it was outside hadn't opened it fully yet, but they were close. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears, trying to think of what to do. I considered waking the kids, but they were upstairs, and I didn't want to risk whatever or whoever was out there hearing them. I grabbed my phone and dialed their parents' number, but the line was silent and they didn't pick up. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was a neighbor, maybe it was nothing. But then the door creaked open just enough to let a small sliver of darkness from the porch spill into the living room. The porch light, which had been on when the parents left, was now off, casting the front yard in complete blackness. That was when I knew something was wrong. I glanced toward the staircase, where the kids were supposed to be asleep. They were too young to understand what was happening, and the last thing I wanted was to scare them. I stepped forward cautiously, making sure my feet didn't make a sound on the wooden floor. I had to check the door, had to be sure it was locked, but as I reached for the handle, my heart stopped. The lock was undone. I yanked the door closed and immediately locked it again, my hands trembling. The noise from the hallway was unsettling, and the silence that followed felt even worse. Whoever had tried to open the door had been close enough to hear me close it, yet no one had come in. I backed away from the door, wondering if I should call the police, but I hesitated. I didn't want to overreact, but something inside me screamed that I couldn't ignore this. The thought of someone out there, watching, waiting, made my skin crawl. I decided to check the front yard, just to make sure no one was hiding in the dark. I peered through the window, straining my eyes to see anything out of place. The porch was empty, but the absence of the porch light disturbed me. The house looked dark and abandoned from the outside, which felt off since the light had been on when I first arrived. I wondered if I had missed something earlier, if I had forgotten to check the porch light when I came inside. I turned away from the window and glanced at the stairs again. The kids were still asleep, and I knew they were safe for now. I needed to stay calm, stay rational, but it was hard when every instinct told me that something was wrong. I grabbed my phone again and tried their parents' number once more. No answer. I tried sending a text this time, asking if they were coming home soon. Still no reply. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me, thick and heavy, as I looked around the room. I decided to lock all the windows just in case and double-check the back door. As I moved through the house, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, just out of sight. But when I reached the back door, I found it securely locked, just like the windows. No signs of forced entry. My heart slowed slightly, but the feeling of unease didn't disappear. When I returned to the front room, I noticed something that I hadn't seen before. The small table by the front door, which usually held a decorative vase and a bowl of keys, was now slightly askew. My heart lurched. I hadn't touched it, and I was sure it had been perfectly positioned when I arrived. I walked over to it, my eyes scanning for anything unusual, but there was nothing else out of place. That's when I heard a noise from upstairs. It was faint, but it was enough to send a jolt of adrenaline through my body. I stood completely still, straining to hear, but the house fell silent again. I waited a moment, but nothing happened. Maybe it was just the house settling, or maybe it was one of the kids turning in their sleep. I wasn't sure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I took one last look at the front door, where the porch light remained off. I knew I had locked it earlier. Had I imagined it being unlocked? Was I just overreacting? I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that I was just being paranoid. But then, as I was about to turn away, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of the front door unlocking. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone, dialed 911 and whispered, "Someone's trying to break in." The operator on the other end was calm, asking for details and telling me to stay on the line. My heart was racing as I stood there, my back pressed against the wall, listening for any further movement. The door handle jiggled once more, but this time it didn't open. I waited for what felt like hours, staring at the door, hoping that the police would arrive soon. When they finally did, they searched the house but found nothing. The door had been locked all along, and there were no signs of anyone having been there. Well, I couldn't explain it, but I wasn't sure I wanted to. As I left the house, the porch light flickered back on, casting a weak glow over the empty yard. I didn't know if I would ever babysit for them again. The feeling that someone had been watching me, waiting, stayed with me long after I left. Story 4. I was hiking alone, the cool breeze rustling the leaves around me as I made my way through the familiar trail. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a bird or the crunch of twigs beneath my boots. I had been here countless times, but today something felt different. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, glancing around at the dense trees when I noticed something odd. Off to the side of the trail, a set of footprints caught my eye. They were deep impressions in the dirt, as if someone had walked through recently. The strange part was that they didn't seem to follow the trail. They veered off into the woods, disappearing into the thicket of trees and underbrush. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow them, though a small voice in the back of my mind told me to turn around. The footprints were large, almost unnaturally so. Each step left a deep mark, as though the person walking was carrying something heavy, or perhaps even stumbling. The ground was soft here, and the trees were thick, their branches stretching above like a canopy, casting shadows across the trail. I kept my focus on the prints, careful not to trip over the roots that seemed to snake out from the forest floor. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the footprints seemed to grow more erratic, as though the person was in a hurry or disoriented. There was something unsettling about the way they appeared, as if they had been made with a sense of urgency. I paused for a moment, listening to the stillness of the forest, but all I could hear was the faint rustling of leaves. No birds, no squirrels, no sign of any other life. I pressed on, my steps becoming more deliberate as I followed the trail. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. The trees were closer together now, their trunks thick and gnarled, blocking out much of the sunlight. The prints were fresh, but they didn't seem to be leading anywhere in particular. They just continued, twisting and turning as if the person was wandering aimlessly. Then, after what felt like an eternity of walking, I reached a clearing. There, the footprints stopped. It was as if the person had simply vanished. The dirt where the prints had been was undisturbed, the earth smooth and empty. No sign of a struggle, no indication of where the person had gone. I stepped closer, kneeling to examine the ground, my heart beating faster with every second. I looked around the clearing, scanning the area for any sign of movement, but the air was still. The trees stood silent, the only sound being the faint hum of insects. There was nothing unusual about the clearing, except for the abrupt end of the footprints. It didn't make sense. How could someone just disappear like that? I felt a chill run down my spine, a sense of unease creeping over me. The forest seemed different now, as if the trees themselves were watching me. My skin tingled with the feeling that I wasn't alone, though I could see no one. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the distance, and for a moment I could have sworn I heard something faint, almost like a whisper, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. The footprints hadn't just ended, they had vanished. One moment there was a clear path leading deeper into the woods, and the next, it was as if the person had been lifted into the air. My eyes scanned the sky above, but there was no sign of anything unusual. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but the emptiness around me made everything feel wrong. I stepped back, my gaze still fixed on the spot where the prints had stopped. There was no logical explanation for it. I had been hiking for hours, and the woods around me were so dense that there was no way someone could have simply walked off without leaving a trace. The idea that they had been picked up, physically lifted into the air, seemed absurd, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The more I thought about it, the more my mind spiraled. What if it wasn't just a person who had left those footprints? What if there was something else in the woods, something I couldn't see, but could feel watching me? The air felt heavier now, the stillness more oppressive. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking behind me, but the trees were still. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe I was just letting my imagination run wild. After all, there could be a perfectly logical explanation for the footprints, even if I couldn't find it. Still, a part of me felt like I needed to leave, like I was being drawn deeper into something I didn't understand. The silence of the woods was no longer comforting, it was suffocating. I turned to head back to the trail, my pace quickening as I retraced my steps. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The sound of footsteps, soft but unmistakable, echoed in the distance behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart raced as I hurried back toward the path, the unsettling sensation growing stronger with every step I took. By the time I made it back to the main trail, the forest seemed almost normal again. The sounds of birds and insects returned, and the oppressive silence lifted. But the memory of those footprints, of the way they had just ended, stayed with me. I couldn't explain it, and I wasn't sure I wanted to try. All I knew was that something in those woods had shifted, and I wasn't sure it was something I wanted to understand. Story 5. I had just finished a long day at work and was walking home, eager to get inside and relax. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the streets dimly lit by the orange glow of streetlights. It wasn't an unusual route, and I'd walked it countless times before. But tonight something felt different, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. As I walked, I glanced over my shoulder and noticed a man behind me, walking at the same pace. I thought nothing of it at first, people walk in the same direction all the time. But when I crossed to the other side of the street, I saw him do the same. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickened my pace, hoping it was just a coincidence. But the man did not break stride, he mirrored my every move. I told myself I was overreacting, trying to convince myself that there was no reason to be afraid. But as I turned the corner onto a quieter street, the man followed me without hesitation. That's when the cold dread in my stomach turned into a knot of fear. My mind raced as I calculated the distance to my house, trying to figure out how far I was from safety. I glanced over my shoulder again. The man was still there, moving steadily behind me, not slowing down at all. His footsteps were getting closer now, the sound echoing in the quiet night. Panic surged through me, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I confront him? Should I call someone? I didn't have time to think, so I just ran. I sprinted the last block to my house, my breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. The familiar side of my front door never looked so inviting, but I didn't stop to catch my breath. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, and finally managed to unlock the door. I slammed it shut behind me and bolted the locks, the sound of the deadbolt snapping into place almost too loud in the silence. I stood in the hallway for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, my mind still racing. I pressed my back against the door, not daring to move. What had that man wanted? Why was he following me? I didn't know, but I had to stay calm. I slowly backed away from the door, trying to make sure everything was locked up tight. Minutes passed, and I thought I had finally shaken the feeling of dread that had been clinging to me. I stood there, staring at the door, telling myself that the man had gone. He must have just been walking home too. There was no reason to worry, I reassured myself. But then I heard the sharp chime of my doorbell ringing through the house. My blood ran cold. My heart stopped for a moment as I stared at the door, the sound of the doorbell echoing in the stillness. I didn't move. The silence that followed felt suffocating, thick with the weight of uncertainty. I stood there, frozen, listening for any sound outside, any indication of who might be standing on the other side. I didn't dare to answer the door. My mind raced with thoughts, trying to make sense of the situation. Could it be someone else? A neighbor, maybe? But the timing felt too strange. The man who had followed me had been so close there was no way he could have reached my house so quickly, not unless he had been running as well. The doorbell rang again, this time more insistent. I flinched, my nerves on edge. I stepped back, glancing around the room as if searching for a way out. But the only exit was the door, and I wasn't about to open it. I pressed my ear against the wall, straining to hear anything, any hint of what was going on outside. But there was nothing, just the silence and the rhythmic ringing of the bell. I wanted to call someone, my friends, my family, the police, but I couldn't bring myself to move. What if the man was still out there, watching? What if he had been waiting for me to let my guard down, to open the door? I couldn't risk it. I stayed in place, holding my breath and listening for any sounds that might give me a clue. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. The doorbell kept ringing, but there was no voice, no words, just the constant chime that seemed to grow louder and more urgent with every passing second. Eventually the ringing stopped, and a heavy silence filled the house. I didn't dare move, not yet. I waited, tense and alert, listening for any noise that might suggest the man had left. I stood there for what felt like hours, but the silence was unbroken. Slowly, I began to let my guard down, convinced that whatever happened, the man was gone. I waited for a few more minutes before I finally made my way to the window, cautiously pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. My heart sank when I saw that the street was empty. There was no sign of anyone. But just as I was about to turn away, I noticed something strange, a shadow moving near the corner of the street. It was quick, too quick, and I couldn't make out who it was. Suddenly a chill ran down my spine. The man hadn't been just walking home. He had been waiting, watching. And now I realized he might still be out there, just waiting for me to let my guard down. I closed the curtain quickly, feeling the weight of the fear settle back into my chest. It wasn't over. It hadn't been over since the moment I started walking home. Story 6. For the past few days, my phone had been ringing off the hook. The caller ID always showed an unknown number, and no matter how many times I ignored it, the calls kept coming. I thought it might just be a wrong number or a telemarketer, so I didn't give it much thought at first. But as the days went on, the calls became more frequent, and the sensation of unease grew. I started noticing a pattern. Each call would come at the same time, right when I was winding down for the night. I'd hear the phone ring, then hesitate before picking it up, never sure what to expect. Sometimes there was nothing on the other end but the soft hum of static. Other times there was a faint breathing, almost as if someone were listening but not speaking. The more it happened, the more I felt a strange sense of dread creeping in. I told myself I was being paranoid. I blocked the number several times, but it didn't matter. The calls would stop for a few hours, then resume with a different unknown number. I tried to ignore them, convinced it was just some sort of glitch or prank call. But after several sleepless nights, I could no longer deny that something was wrong. One evening, as the phone rang again, I felt a deep sense of hesitation in my chest. I was exhausted, already on edge from the constant interruptions. Part of me just wanted to pick up and end it, so I could move on with my life. I took a deep breath, knowing I might regret it, and answered the call. The voice on the other end was quiet at first, barely audible. It wasn't anything like the casual greetings I had expected from a telemarketer or wrong number. It was low and deliberate, and the words that followed made my blood run cold. "Why do you keep ignoring me?" I froze, my hand tightening around the phone. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of what I had just heard. The voice was strange, but somehow familiar, like a shadow of someone I might have known. It had a harsh, almost sinister quality to it, as if the person on the other end was deliberately trying to unnerve me. I didn't answer at first, unsure of how to react. The words hung in the air, repeating in my mind like a mantra. The silence stretched between us before the voice spoke again, this time more forcefully. "You've been avoiding me for days. Why? Don't you want to talk?" I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My stomach twisted into knots, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever this was had been watching me. It felt personal, like they knew things about me I hadn't even shared. The chilling realization struck me like a blow. This wasn't just some random prank call. Someone was deliberately trying to get under my skin. I forced myself to speak, my voice trembling. "Who is this?" There was a long pause on the other end. For a moment I thought they weren't going to answer at all. Then, just as I was about to hang up, the voice returned, colder than before. "You know who I am. You just don't remember." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't know what to make of it. My mind raced, trying to piece together any connections, any hints, but nothing came to mind. I didn't recognize the voice at all. I wasn't sure if I should hang up, call the police, or just stay on the line and hope for answers. Suddenly the line went dead. I sat there in the stillness, phone pressed to my ear, heart racing. The call had ended, but the dread remained. I looked at the phone screen, but there was no record of the call, just the blank screen staring back at me. My mind was spinning with confusion and fear. I tried to convince myself it was just some elaborate prank, but the more I thought about it, the less likely it seemed. The voice had been too real, too chilling. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, unable to trust my instincts. The silence in my apartment felt suffocating. The calls didn't stop. Over the next few days, they became more persistent, more urgent. The voice would call at random times, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes just before dawn. Every time I picked up the phone, it was the same low, rasping voice. "You're avoiding me again. You know you can't run forever." The words were almost a threat now, dripping with menace. I couldn't shake the feeling that the person on the other end was getting closer, lurking just outside my reach, waiting for me to make a mistake. I stopped answering the calls altogether, but the unease never left. I felt like I was being followed, like someone was always just behind me, watching from the shadows. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus. The voice haunted my every waking moment, always just a phone call away. I became paranoid, checking my surroundings constantly, locking all the doors and windows at night. But nothing seemed to ease the dread that was growing inside me. Then one night I received another call. This time I didn't hesitate. I answered immediately, my heart pounding in my chest. "Why do you keep avoiding me?" the voice whispered. I didn't know what to say. I felt trapped in my own home, my mind racing with possibilities, trying to figure out who this person was and what they wanted. But before I could respond, the voice spoke one final time. "You'll remember soon enough." The call ended abruptly, and I was left in the silence, more terrified than I had ever been. My thoughts were spinning. I didn't know if I was losing my mind or if someone really was playing this sick game with me. Either way, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The calls stopped after that night, but the feeling that I was being watched never did. I couldn't forget the whispered words, the chilling promise that I would remember soon enough. Something was out there, waiting for me to figure it out. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still yet to come. Story 7. I had just moved into my new apartment, a small one-bedroom in an older building on the edge of the city. The place was affordable, with hardwood floors that creaked underfoot and windows that let in just enough light to make the space feel cozy. The landlord had given me the keys, and I couldn't wait to settle in. The only thing that struck me as odd was the old trunk I found tucked away in the back of the closet. It was large, made of dark wood, and covered in dust, almost as if it had been forgotten for years. At first, I didn't give the trunk much thought. I was too busy unpacking boxes and making the apartment feel like home. But over the course of the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right about the trunk. It had a heavy lock on it, one that didn't look like it belonged to an ordinary piece of furniture. It was old, rusted, and worn, as though it had been tampered with before. It gnawed at my curiosity, the thought of what could be inside. The more I ignored it, the more it seemed to call to me. One afternoon, when I found myself alone with nothing to do, I decided to tackle the mystery. I grabbed a pair of pliers from my toolbox and tried to work at the lock. The metal was stubborn, but eventually I managed to snap it open with a satisfying crack. My heart raced as I lifted the heavy lid, unsure of what I was about to find. What I discovered inside made my stomach twist in a way I wasn't prepared for. The trunk was filled with dozens of photographs, hundreds, maybe more. They were all stacked neatly in piles, each one more unsettling than the last. I flipped through them, at first unaware of the eerie connection between them, until I realized what they were. Photos of the previous tenant. She was sleeping in every single one. There were close-ups of her face, her body curled up in bed, her eyes closed in peaceful slumber. The pictures were taken from various angles, as though someone had been standing just outside her room, silently capturing moments when she was most vulnerable. The photos weren't the only disturbing thing. As I continued to flip through the stack, I found some with her in different settings, walking down the street, sitting in a cafe, even at the grocery store. Someone had been watching her. The thought made me feel nauseous, like I was intruding on something private and terrifying. My mind raced as I tried to understand what I had found. Who had taken these photos? And why had they been kept in this old trunk, hidden away for who knows how long? I couldn't stop looking through the pictures. They seemed to tell a story, one that I wasn't sure I was ready to know. In one photo, she was asleep on the couch, with what appeared to be a shadowy figure standing in the doorway behind her. The figure was blurry, almost as if it had been intentionally obscured. In another, she was lying in bed, her sheets twisted around her body. while a faint reflection of a person could be seen in the mirror hanging on the wall. The more I looked, the more the sense of unease grew. As I reached the bottom of the trunk, I found something even more unsettling, a small, handwritten note. It was folded neatly, the paper yellowed with age. I hesitated before unfolding it, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The note read, "I'll always be watching." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I read the words. Who had written it? And why had they left it here, hidden in this trunk? I quickly closed the lid of the trunk, my mind reeling. I didn't know what to do with what I had found. It was clear that the previous tenant had been stalked, followed, and photographed while she slept. The thought of someone having invaded her privacy in such a way made me sick. But what bothered me even more was the fact that the photos seemed to suggest that the person who had been watching her was still out there, lurking in the shadows. Who had left this trunk for me to find? And why? I tried to push the thoughts from my mind as I sat down on the couch, the note and the photos still weighing heavily on my thoughts. I needed to talk to someone, anyone, but I couldn't bring myself to tell my friends or family about it. It seemed so unbelievable, so bizarre, that they would never understand. Instead, I decided to search for the previous tenant. I needed to know who she was, what had happened to her, and if she was still living in the city. After a few hours of searching online, I managed to track down her name, Maggie Reynolds. According to a local news article, she had moved out of the apartment a few months ago, but there was no mention of why. There were no police reports, no complaints, nothing to explain her sudden departure. The only thing I could find was an old social media profile, abandoned and left untouched for months. My thoughts swirled as I stared at the screen, wondering if Maggie had ever realized what was happening to her. Had she known someone was watching her? Had she ever suspected that she was being stalked? And most importantly, was she safe now? The note in the trunk suggested that the person who had been watching her hadn't given up. The idea that someone might still be watching me, just as they had watched her, sent a cold shiver down my spine. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the apartment. The silence felt heavier, the shadows darker. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. The thought that someone could have been in my apartment before, maybe even hiding in the closet, made my heart race. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. The next morning, I went to the landlord, asking if he knew anything about the previous tenant. He was evasive, saying that Maggie had been a quiet, private person who never caused any trouble. He seemed uncomfortable when I mentioned the trunk, almost as if he was hiding something. But when I pressed him, he simply shrugged and said, "It's an old building. You never know what gets left behind." I knew then that I couldn't ignore what I had found. Someone had been watching Maggie, and now they were watching me. The question wasn't if they would come back, it was when. Story 8. I had just finished a long day of traveling for work and was eager to get some rest. The hotel was small but clean, nestled on a quiet street away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The room was exactly what I needed: a comfortable bed, a hot shower, and a desk to catch up on emails. After unpacking my things, I plopped down onto the bed, feeling the weight of the day slowly lift off my shoulders. It was 2 a.m. when the phone on the nightstand rang, startling me awake. I glanced at the clock, groggy from the deep sleep I had just fallen into. The room was pitch black, except for the faint light from the street lamps outside, and for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined the ring. But then it rang again, more insistent this time, and I reached over to pick up the receiver. "Hello?" I answered, my voice thick with sleep. The line was eerily quiet for a moment, and I thought perhaps it was a wrong number or a telemarketer. But then a voice came through, low and deliberate, sending an immediate chill down my spine. "Oh, don't look outside your window." The voice was calm, but there was something unsettling about it, like it knew something I didn't. I froze, the words echoing in my mind. Who would call at this hour with such an ominous message? I sat up in bed, my heart starting to race. There was no explanation, no follow-up, just those 4 words lingering in the air between us. "Who is this?" I asked. But the voice on the other end didn't respond. It just hung there in silence, as though daring me to ask again. I pressed my ear to the receiver, but there was no more sound, just dead air. I hung up, feeling a mixture of confusion and unease. The phone call was unsettling, but I couldn't figure out why. I looked around the room, everything seeming just as it had been before. Nothing was out of place. Still, the weight of the words stayed with me, and a creeping feeling of dread started to seep into my thoughts. I told myself it was nothing, probably some prank call or some weird hotel glitch. It didn't make sense, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My eyes darted to the window where the streetlights cast long shadows across the curtains. I resisted the urge to look outside, telling myself that I was overthinking it. But the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the urge became. I sat there in the darkness, my thoughts racing. Who would know I was in this room? Who would know to call me at this time of night with a warning like that? A part of me wanted to get up, go to the window, and see for myself. Another part of me was paralyzed by the thought of what might be out there. After what felt like an eternity, I finally got the courage to stand. My legs felt like lead as I approached the window, a battle raging inside my mind. I could hear the faint hum of the city outside, the usual noises of traffic and people talking in the distance. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but that feeling, that nagging, gut-wrenching feeling lingered. I reached for the curtain, my hand trembling slightly. I paused just before pulling it back, my heart thudding in my chest. What if someone was out there? What if they were waiting for me to look? But the voice, whatever it had been so certain, so clear. It made me question everything. With a deep breath, I pulled the curtain aside, my eyes immediately scanning the darkness outside. There was nothing. No movement, no shapes, nothing that stood out. The street was empty, save for a couple of parked cars and a flickering light from a nearby sign. For a moment I felt a sense of relief wash over me. Maybe it had all been in my head. Then I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the street, just beyond the reach of the streetlights. They were motionless, as though they were watching me. My breath caught in my throat, and I took an instinctive step back from the window. There was no way they could have been there just seconds ago. I quickly shut the curtains, heart hammering in my chest. I tried to calm myself, but the image of the figure lingered in my mind. Who were they? What were they doing out there in the dead of night? The phone call suddenly made sense, and yet the more I thought about it, the less I understood. I turned away from the window, pacing around the room. The air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. My mind kept circling back to the figure outside. It was too strange to be a coincidence. How had they known I would be in that room at that exact time? How had they known I would look out the window? I considered calling the front desk, asking if they had any idea who could have made the call. But what could I say? That I had received a strange message telling me not to look outside. It seemed ridiculous. I sat back down on the bed, my head spinning. I needed to calm down, to shake off this anxiety. I tried to distract myself, turning on the TV and focusing on a random program. But no matter how hard I tried, the image of that figure, standing motionless in the street, kept flashing in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. that I was being drawn into something I didn't understand. The rest of the night passed in a blur, and I barely slept at all. By morning I was exhausted, but I had no choice but to check out and move on to my next stop. As I passed the front desk, I saw the same manager from the night before. I considered asking about the call, but I couldn't bring myself to. Instead, I left the hotel determined to forget the whole experience. But even now, months later, I can still remember the words clearly. Don't look outside your window. Every time I stay in a hotel, I feel that same sense of unease creeping up on me, reminding me that there are some things in this world we may never fully understand. Story 9. I had been driving for hours, the sun slowly sinking beneath the horizon as I made my way through the backroads of a rural area. I wasn't familiar with the area, but I had used my phone's GPS to navigate, confident that it would guide me to my destination. The roads became narrower, and the trees seemed to close in around me, their shadows stretching long as twilight settled in. I had been lost in thought, taking in the peaceful isolation of the countryside, when my GPS suddenly told me to turn onto a small, unpaved road. The road seemed harmless enough at first, but it quickly became clear that it wasn't going to lead me anywhere useful. The gravel crunched under the tires as I drove deeper into the dense woods. My GPS had gone quiet, probably lost its signal, and the further I went, the more uncertain I became about where I was headed. The road ahead seemed to narrow even more, and there were no other vehicles, no signs of life, just the thickening trees and the sound of my engine humming along. It wasn't until I reached a small clearing that I realized I had made a mistake. The road ended abruptly in front of a thick line of trees, the path completely blocked. I cursed under my breath and put the car in reverse, planning to turn around and find my way back. But as I shifted into reverse, something caught my eye. There, standing in the shadows of the trees, were several men. They hadn't been there just moments ago, and I hadn't seen them approach. My heart skipped a beat as I instinctively pressed the gas pedal, hoping to get out of there. The men didn't seem in a hurry. Slowly, they began to walk toward my car, their steps deliberate and calm. I could barely make out their features in the dim light, but I could tell that they were all wearing dark clothing. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Why were they there? Why weren't they saying anything? The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as a chill crept down my spine. I was trapped at the end of the road with no way out, and these men seemed to be closing in on me. I quickly checked my mirrors, but there was no sign of any other vehicles or people. It was just me and these men in the middle of nowhere. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, my breath becoming shallow as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. My eyes darted between the men, trying to gauge their intentions. They were too close now, and I couldn't afford to waste any more time. My fingers were trembling as I put the car in drive and pressed the gas pedal harder, but the wheels spun in the loose gravel, making little progress. One of the men stepped forward, a few yards away from the front of my car. His face was obscured by a hood, but I could see the glint of his eyes in the dim light. He didn't seem angry or aggressive, but there was something unsettling in his expression, something I couldn't quite place. The other men remained behind him, almost as if they were waiting for something, their eyes trained on me with unnerving focus. I tried again to drive forward, but the tires just spun in place, throwing up clouds of dust and gravel. I was stuck. My heart pounded in my chest, and I fought to stay calm. The man in front of my car stepped closer, and the others followed suit. They didn't say a word, and their movements were slow, almost methodical. It was as if they were waiting for me to make the next move, to show them whether I would panic or remain calm. I knew I had to get out of there, but I wasn't sure if I should try to drive past them or wait for them to make the first move. A sudden thought struck me: what if this was some kind of trap? The men could have been waiting for someone like me to get lost, only to find myself stuck in a situation I couldn't escape. My mind raced through possible scenarios, but none of them were good. If I stayed, I might never leave. If I tried to drive past them, I could risk provoking them. There was no way out. The man who had been in front of the car stepped closer to my window, his face now fully visible. He had a hard look, his eyes intense but not hostile. He leaned down slightly, as if inspecting me, and for a moment I thought he might say something, but all he did was stare. The other men had formed a loose semicircle around my car, watching silently, their eyes never leaving me. My palms were sweaty as I weighed my options. I thought about honking the horn, trying to draw attention to myself, but there was no one around for miles. I considered getting out of the car and asking for help, but that seemed like an even worse idea. There was no telling what these men would do if I got out. My mind was spinning with possibilities, none of them good. Finally, the man by the window straightened up, his eyes still locked on mine. He didn't say a word, but after what felt like an eternity, he turned and motioned for the others to follow him. Slowly, they began to back away, retreating into the trees. I couldn't believe it. They had come so close, yet for some reason they were leaving without a word. I didn't wait around to figure out why. I slammed the car into reverse, finally getting some traction in the loose gravel, and I sped back down the road. My heart was still racing, and I didn't dare slow down until I reached the main road. Even then, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, expecting to see the men following me. But there was nothing. Just the long, empty stretch of road behind me. As I finally reached a more populated area, my nerves began to settle, but the unease stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something much worse. I never did find out who those men were or what they had wanted, but I knew one thing for certain: I would never take another wrong turn in the middle of nowhere again. Story 10. For weeks I had been hearing a soft tapping noise in my apartment. At first I convinced myself it was just the house settling, or perhaps the pipes making noise during the night. But as the nights went on, the tapping grew more frequent and distinct, always occurring in the same pattern: 3 gentle taps, followed by a short pause, and then 3 more. It was faint enough to ignore during the day, but would become impossible to ignore once the apartment settled into silence after dark. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that I was just imagining things, but it was hard to ignore when the tapping seemed to come at the same time every night, around 2 a.m. It was subtle, like a fingernail tapping against a hard surface, but it was there. I would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to stop, but it never did. Some nights it would stop after a few minutes, while other times it would go on for what felt like hours. One evening, as I sat on the couch, the tapping began again. My curiosity finally overtook my growing sense of unease. I had been avoiding it for so long, but the sound was becoming unbearable. I stood up, listening carefully as it echoed through the apartment. I looked around, trying to pinpoint where the noise was coming from, but it was difficult to identify. It seemed to move, shifting between the walls and ceiling like it was following me around. I walked cautiously toward the hallway, my ears straining for the sound. There it was again, 3 soft taps, followed by a pause. I froze, realizing it was coming from my bedroom. My heart raced as I slowly made my way toward the door. I had checked every room in the apartment before, so this was the first time I'd felt like I was getting closer to the source. When I opened the door to my bedroom, the tapping stopped for a moment, only to resume once I stepped inside. I scanned the room, my eyes darting over every corner. The tapping seemed louder now that I was closer. It wasn't coming from the walls or the floor. It was coming from somewhere above me. Slowly, I looked up at the ceiling. That's when I noticed an air vent on the wall, right above my bed. The tapping was coming from inside it. My stomach dropped as I stood there, staring at the vent. What could be causing it? The idea of something living inside the walls of my apartment was terrifying, but it made sense. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, too afraid to approach the vent. But the sound wouldn't stop. I took a deep breath and carefully climbed up onto the bed, bringing my ear close to the vent. The tapping continued, steady and rhythmic. I felt a chill run down my spine as I wondered if I should call someone an exterminator, a handyman, or maybe even the police. But what would I tell them? That something was making noises in my vent at night. It sounded ridiculous. Oh. The tapping grew louder, as if it was getting closer, or perhaps whatever was inside the vent was moving around. I felt an overwhelming urge to open the vent, to see if there was something trapped inside, or perhaps an animal that had gotten in somehow. I grabbed a small chair from the corner of the room and set it beneath the vent. As I climbed onto the chair, I hesitated for a moment, feeling a sense of dread wash over me. But I couldn't ignore the noise anymore. I needed to know what it was. I carefully pried the vent cover off with my fingers, wincing as it squeaked loudly. My heart raced as I peered into the opening, trying to see if anything was inside. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. I almost felt a sense of relief. Maybe it was just dust or something else harmless after all. But then I heard it again. The tapping, this time louder and much more frantic. It was coming from deep within the vent, much further than I had expected. It was like something was trapped inside, desperately trying to escape. I pulled back, a wave of panic rising within me. What the hell was going on? The tapping continued, each sound growing more urgent than the last. I took a few steps back, my breath shallow and fast. There was no way I was going to stick my hand in there. But just as I was about to walk away, I heard something else, a faint scratching noise, as though something was trying to climb its way out of the vent. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Was it an animal? A rat? A squirrel? I had no idea how something could have gotten into the vent, but it didn't make any sense. I'd lived in this apartment for months, and there was no sign of any damage to the vents. I didn't know what to do. The thought of calling for help, telling someone that something was inside my vent, made me feel ridiculous. But the sound, the frantic tapping and scratching, made it impossible to ignore. I finally grabbed my phone and called the building maintenance number, barely able to speak because of how terrified I felt. I explained the situation in a shaky voice, telling them that something was inside my bedroom vent and making strange noises. The man on the other end of the line was skeptical at first, but he promised to send someone over to check it out. I wasn't sure if I felt better or worse about it, but I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. The maintenance man arrived an hour later. I stood in the hallway, pacing nervously while he examined the vent. He removed the cover, peering inside with a flashlight. For a moment he stood there, silent. My stomach twisted with anxiety as I waited for him to say something. Finally, he looked back at me, his face pale. "There's nothing in there," he said, his voice uncertain. "I don't know what to tell you. It's just an empty vent." But as he walked away, the tapping started again, soft at first, then gradually growing louder. Story 11. I had agreed to house sit for my friend, Sarah, while she was away for a week. The house was cozy and familiar, a place I'd visited often, so it was easy for me to settle in. I spent my days running errands, catching up on TV shows, and lounging on the couch. It was meant to be a relaxing week, a way to escape the hustle of my usual routine. One evening after a long day, I plopped down on the couch with a book and a cup of tea. The house was quiet, and I was looking forward to some peace and solitude. As I sank into the cushions, I absent-mindedly glanced around the room, my gaze shifting to the shelf where Sarah kept her collection of books. That's when I noticed something strange, a small, shiny object peeking out from behind a stack of novels. Curiosity tugged me. I got up and walked over to the shelf, brushing aside the books to get a better look. At first, I thought it might be a light reflection from a decorative item, but as I cleared the books, I realized what it was: a tiny, black camera lens staring back at me. My heart skipped a beat. The camera was pointed directly at the couch, right where I had been lying earlier that evening. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. At first, I wondered if it was some sort of security camera Sarah had set up for safety, though it didn't make sense that it was positioned in such a way. There was no sign of a security system in the house, no cameras in any other rooms. I touched the camera cautiously, turning it slightly to see if there were any markings or signs of who had placed it there. But it looked ordinary, nothing out of the ordinary except for its unsettling placement. My mind raced, and 1,000 thoughts flooded my head. Was it a prank? Did Sarah put it there to catch me doing something silly while she was away? Or worse, had someone I didn't know been watching me while I stayed here? My stomach churned, and I could feel my palms sweating as I picked up my phone and called Sarah. The phone rang twice before she answered. "Hey, what's up?" she asked, her voice light and cheerful. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the edge in my voice. "I found something weird here. A camera behind the books on the shelf. It's pointing right at the couch." There was a long pause on the other end, and I could almost hear her processing the information. "Wait, what?" "A camera," she finally said, her tone changing. "That's really strange. I don't have any cameras in the house." I felt my heart sink. "I didn't think you did. It's really small. It's been there for a while, I think. Maybe you should come home." "Hold on, I'll check with my roommate. Maybe they put it there, just for fun, for security or something," Sarah said quickly. I heard a rustling sound as she moved the phone away briefly. "I'll call you back in a few minutes, okay?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I hung up and set my phone on the table, trying to breathe through the growing sense of dread. The idea of someone watching me from the shadows made my skin crawl. I walked around the room looking for any other signs that I was being watched. There were no other cameras, no strange devices, just the usual trinkets and bookshelves. But the thought of that camera, hidden in plain sight, made me feel like I was never truly alone. Minutes passed, and I found myself pacing back and forth. The silence of the house seemed to press in on me. I wanted to ignore it, to tell myself it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. I stood in front of the shelf again, staring at the camera, trying to think of a rational explanation. But no matter how many possibilities I considered, the thought that someone had placed it there with intent to spy on me felt too real to ignore. When Sarah finally called me back, I picked up the phone with a nervous hand. "Hey," I said, my voice tight, "what did you find out?" "Okay, so weird news," Sarah began. "Apparently one of my old roommates set up a camera like that years ago. I had no idea it was still there. He told me he used it to watch over the house, but never mentioned anything about it being active. I guess he thought it would be funny or something. I had no idea it was still in place." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. "So it was there the whole time?" I asked, feeling my nerves start to settle slightly. But even as I spoke, I wasn't convinced. Something didn't sit right with me. "Yeah, It must have been. I'm sorry. I didn't know, she said. If it makes you uncomfortable, just move it out of the way or something. I'll make sure it's removed when I get back. I thanked her, though my mind was still swirling with questions. The fact that it had been there for so long, hidden so well, made me uneasy. I couldn't stop picturing that small camera lens, its dark eye always watching, always waiting. I wanted to leave the house, but I didn't feel safe going anywhere after dark. So I decided to stay in the bedroom, away from the couch, locking the door behind me. The rest of the night was restless. I tried to sleep, but the thought of being watched lingered in my mind, keeping me awake. Every creak of the floorboard seemed too loud. Every gust of wind outside felt like a whisper, a signal that someone was nearby. When Sarah finally returned home a few days later, I was relieved, though the unease still clung to me. She had the camera removed immediately, but the feeling of being watched never quite left. It wasn't until weeks later, after we had talked more about it, that Sarah found a note hidden in the box of the camera. It read simply, "Don't worry, I'll always be watching." The words chilled me to the bone. Whoever had placed the camera didn't just want to spy, they wanted to make sure I knew they were there, even when I didn't. Story 12. It was well past midnight when I found myself at the laundromat, the hum of the machines and the sterile fluorescent lights creating an eerie atmosphere. I had been meaning to wash my clothes earlier, but work and other things had kept me from doing so. Now, standing in the dimly lit room, I was the only one there. I pushed the laundry into the machine and sat down on the plastic chair, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling in. As I stared at the spinning load of clothes, I tried to push the silence out of my mind. The only noise was the occasional rattle of the machines and the rhythmic whoosh of the dryer vents. That's when I noticed him sitting a few seats away from me. He wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, just staring at the wall, but something about his stillness made me uneasy. He didn't seem to belong in the space. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up when I heard his voice, low and raspy, as he leaned closer to me. "I saw you here last week," he whispered, the words cutting through the silence like a knife. My breath caught in my throat. It was my first time at this laundromat. I had never been here before, and yet this man was acting like we had some shared history. I turned to look at him, but his face was obscured by the hood of his jacket, the shadows of the laundromat hiding his features. I forced a smile, hoping to brush off the strange comment. "I think you might be mistaken," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. I wasn't sure why, but I felt an odd sense of fear creeping up on me, mixing with confusion. He didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, I thought maybe he had realized his mistake. Maybe he was just another tired late-night laundromat patron trying to make small talk. But then he leaned in closer, the sound of his breath shallow and ragged. "No, I saw you here last week," he repeated, his voice almost a hiss now. I could feel his eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. My pulse quickened, and I had to force myself not to bolt from the room. There was something unsettling in his certainty, like he knew something I didn't, something I couldn't remember. I wanted to ask him how he could possibly know that. Maybe he had mistaken me for someone else. Maybe I was being paranoid. But the words didn't come out. Instead, I swallowed hard, my gaze shifting nervously around the laundromat. The place was still empty, but I began to feel claustrophobic, like the walls were closing in on me. The man shifted in his seat, the sound of his body scraping against the plastic chair breaking the silence. I could feel his presence beside me, his energy weighing heavily in the air. I wanted to get up, to move away, but I felt rooted to the spot. My mind raced through 100 different possibilities, none of them comforting. Was he following me? Was I in danger? "I know what you're thinking," the man continued, his voice barely audible now. "You don't remember me, but I remember you. I saw you last week sitting in that same spot, the same way." I froze. My stomach churned. I felt the blood rush from my face as I thought back to the last time I had been at a laundromat. But it wasn't possible. I had never been here before. Had I? I tried to remember, but the thought was like trying to grasp fog slipping through my fingers out of reach. My thoughts were interrupted when he leaned even closer, his breath hot against my ear. "Don't worry," he murmured. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just wanted to see if you remembered." The words made my skin crawl, and I couldn't hold back a shudder. I had to get out of there. I stood up abruptly, making the decision to leave before whatever was happening became clearer or worse. But as I stood, the man's hand shot out and gripped my wrist tightly. I jerked back in surprise, my heart slamming in my chest. His grip was firm, but not painful, and I could feel his eyes on me, even though his hood still concealed his face. "Wait," he said softly, his voice almost kind. "You'll remember soon enough." I yanked my arm free from his grip and backed away quickly, my mind in a panic. My legs shook, and I could barely catch my breath as I darted toward the door. He didn't try to stop me this time, but his presence felt suffocating, like he was still watching me as I fumbled for the door handle. My fingers grazed the cold metal, and I wrenched the door open, almost tumbling out into the cold night air. Once outside, I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The parking lot was empty except for my car, its headlights dimly illuminating the asphalt. I quickly got in, locking the doors behind me. My hands were still shaking as I turned the key in the ignition, and I pulled out of the parking lot with shaky hands gripping the steering wheel. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the encounter. I glanced in my rearview mirror as I drove away, but the laundromat was already far behind me. The streets were quiet, the world outside calm. I tried to convince myself that it was just a weird interaction, nothing more, nothing less. But as I drove, the man's words echoed in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. "You'll remember soon enough." What did he mean by that? How could he know something I didn't? For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't just left the laundromat. I had fled from something more than just a strange man. I felt like I had narrowly escaped something sinister, something that was waiting for me to remember, but what? I didn't know. All I could do was drive, and try to forget what had happened. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before I would remember. Story 13. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone after a long day at work. The apartment was quiet, the only sound coming from the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. It had been a peaceful evening, just the way I liked it. As I mindlessly scrolled, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was short, but it made my heart race. "Your window's open." I glanced up, feeling a chill run down my spine. I wasn't sure what the message meant or who it was from. I hadn't been expecting a text from anyone, especially not from a number I didn't recognize. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of prank or wrong number. But there was an unsettling feeling creeping up on me. I immediately looked over at the living room window. Sure enough, it was slightly ajar. I knew I had closed it earlier. A wave of panic swept over me. I had been home alone all evening, and there was no way I could have left the window open without noticing it. I stood up quickly, my pulse racing, and walked over to the window. The cool evening air rushed in, and I felt a slight draft against my skin. I peered outside, half expecting to see someone lurking just beyond the glass. But the yard was empty, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. No one was in sight. I reached for my phone again, my fingers trembling as I unlocked it. The message was still there, staring at me. "Your window's open." No other context, no explanation, just those chilling words. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was this a prank? Was someone watching me? I looked around the apartment, checking the other windows, the doors, anything that might offer an explanation, but everything seemed normal. I tried to calm myself, taking slow, deep breaths. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was someone who had the wrong number. But the more I thought about it, the more the unease settled in. Who knew my window was open? Who had been watching me? I moved away from the window and started pacing the room, my eyes constantly darting to the door and the other windows. The sense of being watched was growing stronger. Just as I was about to send a message back asking who it was, my phone buzzed again. This time the message was more direct. "I see you." My blood ran cold. I froze, staring at the screen. My first instinct was to lock the door and the windows, but I already had done that earlier. I had checked everything thoroughly, and everything had seemed secure. Yet, now, it didn't feel like it. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I leave the apartment? The thought of going outside into the dark made me feel even more vulnerable. I walked over to the window again, this time pulling the curtains tightly shut, trying to block out the unsettling feeling. But even with the curtains drawn, I couldn't shake the sense that someone was out there, watching me. I could almost feel eyes on me, even though I couldn't see anyone. The air in the room felt heavier, as though something was pressing down on me. I needed to do something. And I texted back, "Who is this?" But there was no reply. I waited, staring at my phone, but nothing came through. The silence in the room was deafening. I couldn't understand what was happening. Who was messing with me? Why hadn't they said anything more? The only thing that seemed clear was that they knew something about my apartment, something they shouldn't have known. I checked the door again, double-locked it, and glanced at the hallway leading to the bedroom. The apartment was small, and I knew I would be able to hear anyone approaching. But the thought of someone being in the building, possibly even in the hall outside, filled me with dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Suddenly, I heard a faint noise from the other room, a soft creak, like the sound of a floorboard shifting under weight. My heart stopped for a moment. Was someone inside? Had they been there the whole time, just waiting? I grabbed my phone again and tried to call a friend, anyone, but the call wouldn't go through. The screen showed a connection error, and I tried again, but it was the same. I felt completely cut off from the outside world. I moved slowly toward the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the carpet. My mind was racing, my body tense, ready to spring into action if I needed to. But as I reached the doorway to the bedroom, I stopped. The faint noise I had heard before was now louder, more distinct. It was coming from the closet. My heart thudded in my chest as I stood frozen in place. The closet door was cracked open just enough to let a sliver of darkness escape. The shadows inside seemed to stretch, as if something was standing there, waiting. My breath caught in my throat, and I didn't know whether to scream, run, or call for help. But all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by fear. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it was a new message, one that made my blood run cold. "Behind you." I turned around in a rush, but the room was empty. Nothing but shadows and the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the next room. My pulse was racing, my mind spiraling. I felt like I was losing control. Whoever this was, they were toying with me, playing some twisted game. I couldn't keep doing this. I needed to get out. But before I could move, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was as empty as it had been moments before, but I could still hear the footsteps, faint at first, but growing louder, closer. I ran to the front door, flung it open, and didn't look back. The chill night air hit me as I stepped outside, but I didn't stop. I didn't know if I was being followed, or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there a moment longer. The message "your window's open" echoed and echoed in mind, and I didn't feel safe anywhere anymore. Story 14. The underground parking garage was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of overhead lights flickering. I had just parked my car, the metallic clank of the door slamming shut echoing through the hollow space. It was late, the garage almost empty, with only a few cars scattered between the concrete pillars. I could feel the silence pressing in, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. As I began to walk toward the elevator, I heard something behind me. A soft, deliberate shuffle footsteps on the cold concrete floor. I froze for a moment, my heart skipping a beat. The echo of the steps seemed off, like they were a few paces behind me but perfectly in sync with mine. When I turned around, my eyes scanned the dimly lit garage, but there was no one in sight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as the footsteps stopped abruptly. I felt an uncomfortable pressure in the air, a strange tension that hadn't been there moments before. I took a few more steps forward, hoping to shake off the unease, but then I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of someone running, their feet pounding the concrete with urgency. The noise was louder this time, and it sounded closer, but when I glanced behind me, the space was still empty. I stood there for a moment, my breath coming quicker now. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Was it a prank? Someone hiding behind a car, trying to scare me? I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. There was no way. The garage had been empty when I parked, and there was no one else around. Yet the footsteps were real, audible, clear, and growing closer. I turned toward the elevator, my pace quickening. The strange running sound grew louder, the pounding footsteps now unmistakably right behind me. It was as though whoever it was getting closer with every second. I quickened my steps, panic starting to rise in my chest. The elevator was still a few yards away, and the distance felt like miles. My pulse thundered in my ears as I moved faster, my shoes clicking against the cold, smooth floor. Just before I reached the elevator, I risked another glance over my shoulder. Nothing. The garage was just as empty as it had been moments ago. My breath came in short gasps as I hit the button for the elevator, the sound of my frantic heartbeat almost drowning out the faint humming of the lights. I pressed the button again, my finger trembling as I waited for the doors to open. The sound of running footsteps ceased suddenly, and in that moment, I felt as though the whole garage had gone completely still. It was an unnatural stillness, one that made the air feel thick and suffocating. I looked toward the entrance to the garage, hoping to see a car approaching or someone walking in, but there was no sign of movement. The place felt empty, too empty. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and I rushed inside, pressing the button for the ground floor without even thinking. My hand gripped the railing inside the elevator tightly, knuckles white from the tension that had seized my body. The faint echo of the footsteps was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still in the garage with me. The elevator descended slowly, the metallic hum of the cables pulling me down into the depths of the building. I tried to focus on the sound, to calm my breathing, but the silence was deafening. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure standing there, watching me. Nothing. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. When the elevator reached the ground floor, the doors opened with another soft chime. The lights in the lobby flickered slightly, but the area seemed completely normal. I stepped out, still on edge, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. I glanced over my shoulder one last time as I walked toward the exit, half expecting to see someone following me. But the space was still empty. The garage was silent, and for the first time I realized how quiet it was. I reached the exit, stepping out into the night air. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to calm my nerves, the chill of the evening air grounding me somewhat. The night seemed peaceful, almost unnervingly so. I looked back at the entrance to the garage, unsure if I was imagining things or if I had just narrowly escaped some strange encounter. I didn't stay long, hurrying toward my car, my eyes scanning the shadows around me. I started the engine, the low hum of the car's motor filling the silence as I drove away. But even as I left the parking garage behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one who had left that night. I looked into the rearview mirror as I pulled out of the parking lot, but the garage was already out of view, swallowed by the darkness. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone, even if the footsteps had stopped. Story 15. I had taken my dog, Max, for his usual evening walk through the quiet neighborhood. It was late, and the streets were empty, save for the occasional passing car. The night air was crisp, and the only sound was Max's leash dragging along the pavement. He was a calm dog, a golden retriever, who enjoyed the walk as much as I did, but tonight, something felt different. We turned the corner onto a familiar street lined with bushes and tall trees. Max, as usual, trotted ahead, sniffing along the way. I wasn't paying much attention, lost in my own thoughts, when I suddenly noticed he had stopped. His body was rigid, his ears perked up, and he was staring intently at something. It wasn't like him to freeze like this, so I paused and looked over at him, wondering what had caught his attention. Max let out a low growl, a sound I rarely heard from him. His growl wasn't the playful one he sometimes made when he saw another dog. This one was deeper, more menacing. I followed his gaze, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw that he was focused on a bush near the edge of the sidewalk. The leaves rustled slightly, and in the dim light it was hard to make out anything clearly. But something about the way Max was reacting made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I took a step forward, my breath catching in my throat. "Max, what is it?" I whispered, though I knew he couldn't answer. I reached for my flashlight in my pocket and flicked it on, pointing the beam toward the bush. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the space between the branches, and that's when I saw them. Two eyes, glowing faintly, staring back at me from the darkness of the bush. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a cat, something harmless. But the longer I looked, the more I realized something wasn't right. The eyes didn't blink, they didn't move, and they seemed too still for any normal animal. They glowed with an eerie, almost unnatural light, reflecting the beam of my flashlight in a way that made my heart race. Max's growling grew louder, more intense, as if he could sense the danger that I couldn't quite place. I stood frozen for a moment, my breath shallow, unsure of what to do. The eyes were still staring at me, unblinking and unyielding. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Was it some sort of prank? Maybe someone hiding in the bushes? But that didn't explain the cold, unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. I stepped back, taking Max's leash in hand and giving it a gentle tug. "Let's go, boy," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. But Max refused to move. His growls grew louder, and his body tensed even more, as if he were preparing to lunge at whatever was lurking in the dark. I pulled on the leash again, but Max didn't budge. Instead, he began to bark, short and sharp, his voice full of warning. The eyes in the bush didn't move. They stayed locked on me, unwavering, as if they were waiting for something. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of there. I didn't know what those eyes belonged to, but I didn't want to find out. But the more I tried to back away, the more Max seemed determined to stay. His barking intensified, and I could feel the tension in his body, like he was ready to protect me at all costs. I shone the flashlight directly into the bush again, trying to get a better look, but all I saw was the pair of eyes still watching. There was no movement, no rustling of leaves, nothing to indicate what I was dealing with. It was like the thing behind those eyes was holding perfectly still, waiting for me to make the next move. I took another step back, my mind racing for an escape plan. Maybe I could make a run for it, take Max, and get back to the safety of my house. Just as I turned to leave, I heard something, a rustling sound coming from the bush. It was a soft sound at first, but then it grew louder, as if something was shifting inside the bushes. Max's growling turned into a frantic bark, and I knew we couldn't stay any longer. I turned sharply and started walking quickly down the street, pulling Max along with me. His barking was relentless, and I could feel his tension in every step, as if he were still trying to protect me from whatever we had just encountered. As we walked away, I dared a glance over my shoulder. The eyes were gone. The bush was empty, and the darkness seemed to swallow the space where they had once been. I stopped in my tracks, trying to process what had just happened. What were those eyes? What was that thing? My mind tried to make sense of it, but the more I thought about it, the more the questions piled up, each one more unsettling than the last. Max, still on high alert, continued to bark in the direction of the bush, refusing to calm down. It wasn't until we had walked several blocks away that he finally seemed to relax, his body easing into a more normal stance. But I didn't feel relieved. I couldn't shake the image of those glowing eyes staring out from the darkness, watching me. When we finally made it back to the safety of my house, I quickly ushered Max inside and locked the door behind us. I stood in the hallway, my heart still racing, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, just a trick of the light, or perhaps an animal I hadn't seen properly. But deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined it. Those eyes had been real, and whatever they belonged to was still out there, waiting. Story 16. I was sitting at a small cafe, sipping my coffee and scrolling through my phone when I saw the text from my mom. "Why is there a man in your apartment?" The words felt like a punch to my gut, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. My mind raced. I lived alone. I hadn't invited anyone over, and no one had a reason to be in my apartment. The only person who ever visited was my mom, but she was hundreds of miles away. I quickly typed back, "What are you talking about?" My fingers trembled as I hit send, my eyes scanning the message over and over as if I had misread it. She had to be mistaken, right? Maybe it was a wrong number, or she had seen something in her own home that made her confused. I was about to type more when my phone buzzed with her response. "I can see him through the window. He's standing in your living room, looking at the door. Should I call the police?" A cold shiver ran down my spine. My heart raced, and my stomach twisted into a tight knot. I looked around the cafe, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. It was impossible. There was no way anyone could be in my apartment. I had checked the locks before I left, and everything was secure. But then why was my mom seeing someone in my place? I stood up quickly, almost knocking over my coffee in the process. I didn't know what to do or how to process the information. "Mom, are you sure?" I typed back, barely able to keep my hands steady. The cafe seemed suddenly too quiet, as if the air had thickened around me, suffocating me. I couldn't sit still, so I paced in small circles, waiting for her response. The next text came a few moments later. Yes, I can see him clearly. He's tall, wearing a dark jacket, and just standing there. He hasn't moved. A sense of dread washed over me. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a neighbor or a friend playing some sort of prank? I didn't have anyone I could think of who would do this, though. I didn't even know anyone who lived near me well enough to think they would enter my apartment without permission. Panic set in as the realization sank in. Someone had gotten inside. Someone had broken into my apartment. "Stay on the phone with me, Mom," I quickly texted back. "I'm coming home now." I stood there, frozen for a moment, staring at my phone in disbelief. How had this happened? My mind was a whirlpool of confusion and fear, and I didn't know what to do. The logical part of my brain told me to call the police, but my mom was already convinced that something was wrong. She was telling me to call the cops, but part of me just wanted to be sure before making a scene. I left the cafe quickly, ignoring the strange looks from the barista and the other patrons. The walk to my car felt like it took forever, my steps quick and uneven as I tried to shake the feeling of being watched. Every sound seemed too loud, every shadow seemed too deep, and the world around me felt off balance. I couldn't stop thinking about my apartment. Was the man still there? Had he heard me leave? What if he was waiting for me to come back? My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I quickly pulled it out. Another text from my mom. "He's moving now. He's sitting on your couch." I couldn't breathe. What the hell was happening? How could this be real? I forced myself to focus on driving, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My heart raced, but I couldn't let it control me. I had to stay calm, but it was so hard. Every second felt like a lifetime, and I was certain I was being followed. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone there. I finally pulled up in front of my building. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, and I could already see the familiar lights in the windows. My heart skipped a beat as I realized the living room light was on. I was sure I had left it off before I left. I reached for my phone, quickly typing a message to my mom. "I'm almost there. Stay on the line." My breath came in shallow bursts, panic setting in again. What if the man was still there? What if he was waiting for me? I rushed into the building, my shoes clattering loudly on the stairs as I made my way up to my apartment. Every floor felt like a step closer to something I didn't want to face. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my legs burning, but I couldn't slow down. I reached my door, my hand trembling as I inserted the key into the lock. The door creaked open, and I was met with an eerie silence. The apartment was exactly how I had left it, quiet and untouched. My heart hammered in my chest as I scanned the room, expecting to see a man standing there. But there was nothing. The couch sat empty, and the living room looked like it always did. I looked back at the door, the hallway beyond it, but nothing seemed out of place. The fear that had gripped me so tightly began to loosen its hold, but I didn't dare let my guard down just yet. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The sense of dread still clung to me, but it was fading. I grabbed my phone and called my mom. "Mom, I'm here." "There's no one," but before I could finish, her voice interrupted me. "There's no one?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You're sure? Because I still see him." I froze, staring at the door to the living room. My breath caught in my throat as I realized something chilling. I wasn't alone after all. on. Story 17. I had been driving for hours, winding through the narrow, desolate back roads of the countryside, far from any signs of civilization. The roads were quiet, save for the occasional rumble of my tires against the asphalt and the hum of my car's engine. The scenery was beautiful, but it had started to feel a little too quiet, as though I had ventured beyond the point of no return. I had been trying to navigate using my GPS, but suddenly the screen froze. I tapped it several times, growing frustrated as it refused to respond, leaving me stranded in an unfamiliar place with no way of knowing which direction to go next. I pulled over to the side of the road, hoping a quick restart might fix the issue. The car idled as I stared at the frozen GPS screen, my thoughts racing. My phone's battery was running low, and the signal was non-existent. The quiet around me felt oppressive, like the silence of a place where no one had passed for miles. I didn't know how long I sat there, but after a few minutes I decided to step out of the car and stretch my legs. As I stepped onto the gravel shoulder, I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The landscape stretched out in all directions, rolling hills, dense trees, and a sky that seemed to go on forever. I couldn't see any signs of life, no other cars, no houses, nothing, just empty, isolated road. I had no idea how I'd ended up here, and I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake by taking this particular detour. I sighed, wondering if I should just try to drive back the way I came and hope for a better signal. Then, I saw him. A figure appeared in the distance, standing in the middle of the road, facing my car. At first, I thought it was just a mirage, a trick of the heat rising from the asphalt. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't. A man was standing there, completely still, with his back straight and his eyes locked onto me. His posture was rigid, and despite the distance between us, I could feel his gaze like a physical weight pressing down on me. My heart skipped a beat as an uneasy feeling crawled up my spine. The man didn't move, not even a twitch. He was dressed in dark clothes, almost blending into the shadow of the road, but his face was pale, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in days. His hair was unkempt, and his features were sharp, almost too sharp, like they didn't belong on a human face. I couldn't tell how long he'd been standing there, but the longer I stared, the more it unsettled me. It was as though he had been waiting for me, or worse, he had been watching me the entire time. I slowly backed away from the car, unsure of what to do. My instincts told me to drive off as quickly as I could, but my body froze, unwilling to leave the safety of the car, just yet. I looked back at my phone, hoping for some sign of connection, but the screen remained stubbornly blank. I felt trapped, like the road had become a maze, and I had wandered into the middle of it with no way out. The man still didn't move. He was like a statue, standing in the center of the road with his eyes fixed on me. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed something else. His expression hadn't changed. It was as if he wasn't even aware of me, or worse, didn't care. His eyes were wide open, but there was a coldness to them, a vacancy that sent a shiver down my spine. I began to wonder if this was some kind of trick, a hallucination brought on by the isolation of the road. My hand started to shake, and I felt my pulse quicken. I told myself it was just some weirdo out for a walk, but deep down, I knew there was something wrong. No one should have been standing there, especially not like that. I thought about driving past him, but the thought of getting any closer made my stomach churn. The air seemed thicker, more suffocating with every second that passed. I tried to reason with myself, maybe he was just lost, like me, but the longer I stood there, the more certain I became that something was terribly off about the situation. I finally decided to start the car, hoping the sound of the engine would drive him away. I shifted into gear and pressed the gas pedal lightly, but the man didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge the sound of the engine. The more I inched closer, the more I felt my hands grip the steering wheel, my knuckles white with tension. My heart raced, and the cold sweat on my forehead seemed to only make the situation worse. The moment I reached him, I almost couldn't believe it. He still didn't move. I glanced out the side mirror, hoping to see him disappear into the distance. But when I looked back, he was still there, standing in the exact same spot. He wasn't looking at my car anymore. He was staring at me through the driver's side window, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed on mine. A wave of panic crashed over me. I slammed the gas pedal to the floor, not caring about the road anymore, only desperate to get away. The car lurched forward, the tires screeching as I sped off into the unknown. My hands were shaking violently, and I could barely keep my eyes on the road as I tried to put as much distance between myself and that man as possible. I didn't look back. For the next hour, I drove with the music cranked up, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. I half expected to see his figure standing on the side of the road, or worse, following me in another car. But the road behind me remained empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was like his gaze had followed me, lingering in my thoughts, creeping into every corner of my mind. Eventually, I found a small town and stopped at a gas station, my hands still trembling. I couldn't even bring myself to tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? It seemed insane even to me. As I refueled the car, I couldn't help but glance at the horizon, half expecting to see that man standing there, watching from the distance. But there was nothing, only the quiet, empty road ahead. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far darker than I could ever understand. Story 18. I had been in the office since late afternoon, trying to finish up a project that had been weighing on my mind for days. The building was unusually quiet, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights above and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. Most of my coworkers had left for the day, and I preferred the solitude anyway, especially when I needed to focus. The silence was comforting, allowing me to immerse myself in the work that had to be done. As the hours passed, the glow from the streetlights outside filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. I found myself zoning out more frequently, my eyes wandering across the empty office space. It was getting late, and I was starting to feel the fatigue set in. I glanced at the clock on the wall, 2:45 a.m. There was no one else in the building, or so I thought. I was typing an email when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway outside my office. I froze, my fingers halting mid-type. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder with each step. There was no mistaking it. Someone was walking down the hallway, close enough that I could hear each footfall clearly. But I was supposed to be alone. My heart began to race, and I felt a wave of unease wash over me. I glanced around the room, but everything appeared as it had been. The desk was cluttered with papers. The computer screen flickered slightly, and the faint sound of the air conditioning hummed in the background. But the footsteps continued, the rhythm steady, as though someone was walking casually down the hall. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor as I tried to listen more closely. The footsteps were growing louder now, unmistakable in their approach. I couldn't see anyone through the frosted glass of the office door, and the hallway outside was dimly lit. There were no other offices nearby, just empty cubicles and the long stretch of hallway that led to the building's exit. I cautiously approached the door and peeked through the small gap between the blinds. Nothing. The hallway was completely empty. There was no one there, no sign of movement. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, it was late and I was exhausted. But the footsteps hadn't stopped. They were still echoing faintly in the distance. I stepped back from the door, unsure of what to do. Should I call security? But the thought of doing so seemed almost absurd after all. The building was supposed to be empty. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I had been working long hours, and maybe my mind was just playing games with me. But the sound of footsteps continued, insistent and unmistakable. I decided to investigate. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number for security, but the call went straight to voicemail. I couldn't understand why no one had answered. I knew that security should have been monitoring the building, especially at this hour, but there was nothing. The footsteps grew louder, closer now, almost as if whoever was walking was standing right outside my door. My pulse quickened. I couldn't stay in the office any longer. I needed to leave to get out of there. I grabbed my coat and quickly moved toward the exit, my footsteps muffled by the sound of the other one still echoing in the hallway. As I reached the door, I hesitated. The footsteps were right behind me, unmistakable now. I could feel the presence of someone or something just beyond the door. I quickly turned the handle and pushed the door open, stepping into the hallway. The air was colder than it had been before, and the silence that followed was deafening. There was no one in sight. I quickly walked down the hallway toward the exit, but the footsteps followed me, always just behind me, never stopping, never speeding up. It was as though someone was walking right in my shadow. I reached the stairwell and hurried down the steps, glancing behind me every few seconds. The footsteps didn't stop, though. They were always there, faint but constant, following my every move. I couldn't understand it. There was no one in the building, no one who could be walking beside me. Yet the sound was undeniable. By the time I reached the ground floor, I was nearly frantic. I was so close to the exit now, so close to safety. The footsteps still followed, and I dared not look back. I could feel my breath coming in short, panicked bursts, my heart racing in my chest. I fumbled with the door handle, finally wrenching it open and stepping into the cool night air. I stood there for a moment, panting and looking back at the building. The lights in the office flickered momentarily, casting strange shadows on the walls. I knew that I had heard something, that the footsteps were real, but when I looked back at the building, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. It was just an empty office building, dark and quiet, just as it had been when I arrived. The next day, I returned to the office, hoping that the strange events of the night before had been a figment of my imagination. But when I entered the building, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The hallway was silent, empty, and the air felt heavier than usual. I walked past the same offices, the same cubicles, but this time I didn't hear any footsteps. Everything was still. But when I passed the hallway where I had heard the footsteps, I noticed something. There were footprints on the floor, leading to the same office where I had been working the night before. They were faint, almost as if they had been left by someone wearing soft shoes. The footsteps led right up to the door of my office, where they stopped abruptly. And then, as if they had never existed, the trail disappeared. Story 19. I had been job hunting for months, sending out dozens of applications with little to show for it. So when I received an email inviting me for an interview at a company I had never heard of, I was eager to go. The address led me to an unfamiliar part of the city, and when I arrived, the office building seemed sterile, almost too quiet. The lobby was empty, and I couldn't help but notice the lack of signs or any indication of which floor the office was on. After a brief moment of hesitation, I decided to go up, figuring the company was just a small startup. I took the elevator up to the specified floor, and as the doors opened, I was greeted by the same emptiness. The office seemed abandoned, with only dim lighting casting long shadows across the polished floors. I checked my watch still a few minutes before the scheduled interview time and took a seat in the lobby area. The silence was unsettling, but I assumed it was just early, and maybe the employees hadn't arrived yet. I thought I might hear footsteps or the sound of ringing phones any moment, but it was eerily still. Moments later, the door to the interview room opened, and a man walked out. He was dressed in a sharp suit, carrying a folder, and his expression was neutral, but not unfriendly. He nodded at me and motioned for me to enter. I followed him into the room, which looked more like a conference room than an office. The walls were bare except for a single framed certificate on the far side, and the room had an odd, clinical feel to it. There was a large table in the center with a few chairs around it, and that's where he motioned for me to sit. I settled into one of the chairs, trying to brush off the odd sensation that this place didn't feel quite right. The man sat across from me, opened the folder, and began asking the usual interview questions. His voice was calm and professional, but there was something robotic about the way he spoke, as if he had memorized the script. I answered his questions, but I found myself growing increasingly distracted by the lack of any personal touches in the room. There were no family photos, no company logos, not even a computer on the desk. It wasn't until the interview was well underway that I realized something was very wrong. I hadn't heard a single noise in the building, no footsteps, no conversations, no distant phone calls. I glanced toward the door I had come through, noticing that it had quietly clicked shut behind me. For a moment I wondered if I had simply imagined it. The door had definitely been open when I entered, but now it was closed, locked, with no way of knowing how it had happened. I tried to shake off the thought, telling myself it was just my nerves, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I tried to focus on the interview, but the man's questions seemed to go on forever, and my answers became more mechanical as my anxiety grew. I needed to get out of there, but I didn't want to appear rude or paranoid. I shifted in my seat, my eyes drifting to the walls. That's when I noticed that there were no windows. The room felt suffocating, like it was isolated from the world outside. I hadn't realized before, but the absence of any windows, any view to the outside world, made the building feel like it was part of some larger labyrinth I couldn't escape. I cleared my throat and tried to subtly glance toward the door. I wanted to ask if I could leave for a moment, but the man's eyes didn't leave his folder. He was completely absorbed in the paperwork in front of him. I couldn't help but notice that the folder he was reviewing appeared completely blank. There were no papers, no notes, just an empty folder he kept flipping through, his gaze never straying from it. I tried not to let my confusion show, but everything around me felt surreal. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. The man didn't react, still buried in his folder. Panic began to rise in my chest as I walked toward the door, reaching for the handle. I expected it to open, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, trying not to let my growing sense of dread consume me. The door remained firmly locked. I turned to face the man again, who was still sitting motionless at the table. I called out to him, but my voice seemed swallowed by the oppressive silence of the room. There was no response. I felt a cold sweat begin to form on the back of my neck as I backed away from the door. The air in the room felt thick, like I was being suffocated by it. I tried the door again, this time with more force, but it refused to give way. I looked around the room in desperation, but there were no other exits, no windows, no way out. My heart pounded in my chest, my breathing shallow and quick as I tried to calm myself down. I told myself this had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe the building was under renovation, or maybe the interview was part of some strange, elaborate test. I took a few more steps back, trying to think of a plan, but before I could react, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps coming down the hallway outside the room. I rushed to the door, my hand on the handle, hoping that whoever it was could hear me and help. But as I peered through the small crack in the door, I saw nothing. The hallway was completely empty. No one was there. The footsteps had stopped. I stepped back, feeling the walls closing in around me. The man across from me hadn't moved an inch. I was trapped in that room, alone with the eerie silence, the locked door, and the feeling that something wasn't just wrong. It was deliberately designed to keep me here. I paced the room, my thoughts racing, trying to think of any way to escape, but nothing made sense. I had been invited here for an interview, but now I wasn't even sure if the company existed at all. Hours passed, and I lost track of time. My mind felt like it was unraveling. The man remained seated, oblivious to my growing panic, his eyes fixed on the empty folder. The door remained locked. The building was empty. There was no way out, and for the first time I wondered if I would ever leave this room. Story 20. I took the subway home late one night after a long day at work. The train was nearly empty, save for a few other tired commuters scattered around. As I sat down and pulled out my phone, I couldn't help but feel a pair of eyes on me. Glancing up, I noticed a man across from me, his gaze fixed directly on mine. His eyes were intense, almost too focused, like he was studying me. I quickly looked away, hoping the feeling would pass, but I couldn't shake the sensation that he wasn't just glancing around like the others, he was watching me. The train rattled through the tunnels, but his stare never wavered. I tried to distract myself by looking out the window, but when I looked back, his gaze was still locked onto me. It made me uneasy, like something wasn't quite right about it, and I wondered if maybe I was overthinking it. As the train approached my stop, I stood up, hoping to shake off the uncomfortable feeling. I gathered my belongings quickly, trying not to make eye contact again. As I stepped off the train and onto the platform, I took a deep breath, relieved to be away from him. But when I turned to walk toward the stairs, I spotted him once more. He had gotten off the train at the same stop. I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe we just lived in the same area. But as I moved through the crowd on the stairs, I felt him right behind me, his presence unmistakable. I couldn't bring myself to look back, afraid that if I did, I'd confirm my suspicions. I could hear his footsteps, steady and deliberate, just a few paces behind me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickened my pace, trying to put some distance between us. When I reached street level, I hurried down the sidewalk, my mind racing. I tried to focus on the walk, ignoring the feeling of his presence lingering behind me. I glanced over my shoulder once and saw him again, still following me, but this time his movements were slower. It was like he was deliberately matching my pace, never too far behind, but never too close, like a predator toying with its prey. I turned a corner and ducked into an alley, hoping to lose him, but when I looked back, he was still there. He had followed me into the alley, and now he was standing at the entrance, his eyes not leaving me. My heart pounded as I walked faster, but the alley led to a dead end. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped. There was nowhere to go, no one to help. I thought about calling the police but dismissed the idea. What would I say? That a man was following me from the subway. I couldn't even explain why it felt so wrong. I took a deep breath and turned back toward the street, hoping he had lost interest. But when I emerged from the alley, he was still standing there, watching me. It was as if he had been waiting, anticipating my next move. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew I had to get away. I broke into a run, my footsteps echoing through the empty street, desperate to get home. I rounded the corner of my block, hoping I was losing him, but when I glanced behind me, I saw him again. He was still following, still moving with the same slow, deliberate steps. I could feel his gaze on the back of my neck, and I started to fear for my safety. My apartment was only a few houses down, but I wasn't sure I could make it without him catching up to me. As I approached the front door, I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking. When I finally got the door open, I rushed inside and slammed it shut behind me. I locked the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I leaned against the door, trying to steady my breath, hoping I was safe. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Through the window, I could see him standing across the street, his figure silhouetted against the dim streetlights. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring directly at my window. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel the weight of his gaze even from across the street. My pulse raced, and I backed away from the window, pulling the blinds shut as quietly as I could. I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe he was just passing through. Maybe he wasn't even aware of my apartment. But everything about the way he followed me, how he never broke his gaze, it felt intentional, and it felt dangerous. I felt trapped in my own home, the feeling of being watched unbearable. I grabbed my phone and texted a friend, explaining the situation and asking if they could come over, but I didn't get a response. I didn't want to call the police just yet. I wasn't sure if they would take me seriously. The minutes dragged on and I kept peeking through the blinds, watching him stand there, motionless, his figure a dark shadow in the night. I finally decided I couldn't stay inside like this, constantly watching the window, afraid he would somehow make his way inside. I gathered my things and, as quietly as I could, left through the back door. I needed to get away from him, to find a place where I wasn't alone. I didn't know where he had gone or what his intentions were, but one thing was clear. He wasn't just a random stranger. He was someone who had been following me, someone who had been watching me, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out why. As I made my way down the street, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him again, but he was gone. I still couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there, somewhere, watching me, waiting for the right moment to appear. The thought of him lingering just beyond the corner of my mind made it impossible to feel safe again. Story 21. It was an unusually quiet night, one of those where the world outside seemed to be holding its breath. I had just finished watching a movie and was lying in bed half awake when my doorbell rang. The chime echoed through the house, loud and jarring in the stillness of the early morning hours. I groggily glanced at the clock on my nightstand, -3 a.m. I wasn't expecting anyone. No deliveries, no friends coming over, no reason for someone to be at my door. I pushed myself up, feeling the weight of this strange hour pressing down on me. My first instinct was to ignore it. Maybe it was just a mistake. But something about the unexpectedness of it made me uneasy. I reached over to my phone and opened the security camera app to see who was at the door. The image on the screen made my heart skip a beat. A man stood on the porch, his face partially obscured by a hood. He didn't knock, didn't move, just stood there, motionless, staring at the door. His posture was unnaturally still, as if he were waiting for something. For a moment I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was a glitch in the feed, or the camera was picking up something out of context. But as I stared at the screen, it became clear that the man wasn't just standing there, he was waiting. I was frozen in place, unsure of what to do. My first thought was to call the police, but I hesitated. What if it was nothing? What if I was overreacting? After all, it could just be some late-night prank or a random passerby. But no one ever came by at 3 a.m., at least not in this quiet neighborhood. The man's stillness made it all the more unsettling. It wasn't like he was knocking, or pacing, or even acting erratically. He was just there, unmoving, as though he had all the time in the world. Minutes passed. I kept watching the feed, hoping that he would leave, but he didn't. The longer he stood there, the more uncomfortable I became. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that he was probably just waiting for someone, that this was all a coincidence. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I turned off the lights in my living room to see if he would notice. His eyes were hidden in the shadow of his hood, but I could still feel his presence on the other side of the door, like a weight pressing against me. Another 10 minutes passed, and I was starting to lose my nerve. The man hadn't moved an inch. He just stood there, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, his head slightly tilted, as though he were watching the door. Watching me. My mind raced with possibilities. Was he waiting for me to open the door? Was he trying to intimidate me? Or was he simply a strange figure who had lost his way in the middle of the night? I grabbed my phone again, my hands shaking as I debated whether or not to call the police. But something told me that calling would only escalate the situation, drawing attention to myself. What if he was just waiting for me to make the first move? I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, loud and frantic. The stillness in the house felt suffocating, as if the world had stopped turning outside of that moment. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, he moved. But not in the way I expected. He took a slow step back, his feet making no sound on the porch. It was like he had been holding his breath this entire time. For a moment I thought he was finally going to leave. But instead he turned around, walking away without a word, his back now to the camera. I watched him disappear into the shadows of the night, the image on my phone slowly blurring as he moved farther from the camera's view. My body finally released the tension it had been holding, but my mind was still racing. Why had he stood there for so long without knocking? What had he been waiting for? And why hadn't he made a sound? I felt like I was left with more questions than answers. I stayed up for the next hour, watching the camera feed, hoping for any sign of movement outside. But nothing. The man didn't return, and the stillness of the night was restored. The feeling of unease lingered in the air, though. I couldn't shake the image of him standing there, motionless, staring at the door as if he had all the time in the world. His silence had been so deliberate, so eerie, that it made the whole event feel like a carefully staged performance. When the morning finally arrived, I tried to push the whole incident to the back of my mind. I told myself that maybe it had been a misunderstanding, maybe it had been a harmless passerby or someone in need of help. But the image of that man, standing motionless at my door, haunted me for days afterward. I couldn't stop thinking about it. What if he had been waiting for something more than just a knock on the door? What if he had been waiting for me to open it? I replayed the video feed over and over in my mind, analyzing every frame. But no matter how much I looked, I couldn't make sense of what had happened. There were no clues, no explanation for his actions. The man's face had been hidden, his intentions a mystery. A few days later, I received a strange email, one I had never expected. It was from an unknown address. with just one line of text, "I'll be back." I stared at the screen, my stomach sinking. The doorbell ringing at 3 a.m. had been unsettling enough, but now this strange message sent a chill down my spine. It felt like the beginning of something much worse. Story 22. I was halfway through my weekend getaway when my phone buzzed with a notification from my home security system. Front door open. I paused mid-conversation with a friend at the restaurant, my heart pounding. It was just past 9 p.m. and I was miles away, staying in a cozy cabin for the weekend. The thought of my front door wide open made my stomach twist. My apartment should have been locked and secure. I quickly opened the security app and checked the live feed of my front door camera. Sure enough, the door was ajar, just a few inches, as if someone had left it slightly open in passing. There was no movement in the hallway, no sign of anyone around. I tried to shake off the unease that was creeping in. Maybe the wind had done it. Maybe I had forgotten to close it properly before I left. But a nagging feeling wouldn't let me dismiss it that easily. I called my neighbor Steve, who lived just a few floors down, and asked if he could check on the door. His voice crackled through the line, half drunk, as he muttered something about being busy with a movie. "Just go over and make sure everything's okay," I insisted. "The door's open and I'm out of town." After a few minutes of reluctance, he agreed to help. I watched the video feed again, searching for any hint of a person or movement in the background, but there was nothing. It was like the house was abandoned, yet the door was still ajar. While I waited, I kept glancing nervously at the front door footage, hoping Steve would send a message soon to calm my nerves. Time seemed to stretch as I sat at the table, the laughter of my friends around me becoming muffled. Every second that ticked by felt longer than the last, each minute pressing against my chest. The longer I waited, the more my mind raced with the worst possible scenarios. Someone could be inside my apartment, rifling through my things, or worse, waiting to ambush Steve when he arrived. Finally, my phone rang and I quickly answered. It was Steve. "Hey, it's locked now," he said casually, as if everything was fine. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "Thanks, man," I said, finally able to breathe. But just as I was about to hang up, Steve's voice faltered. "It was weird though," he said, dragging the words out. "I could have sworn I saw someone standing in your kitchen when I knocked, but when I looked inside, it was empty." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "What do you mean someone was standing there?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Steve muttered. "It was like they were standing just inside the door, but when I opened it, there was no one there. I thought I was just seeing things," but he trailed off, the silence between us heavy. "Maybe it was just your imagination," I said quickly, trying to push the thought away. "Everything's fine, right? Right?" "Yeah," Steve responded, though his tone was uncertain. "I locked up, though. Your door's definitely secure now." I hung up the phone, my heart still racing, and tried to shake the feeling of unease that clung to me. The rest of the night went by in a blur. I couldn't focus on my friends, couldn't relax. My mind kept returning to Steve's words. "I saw someone standing in your kitchen." Had it been a ghost? Or was someone really in my apartment while I was away? That night, I barely slept, tossing and turning in the cabin, my phone beside me in case Steve called back with more news. But there were no calls, no messages, just the occasional vibration of notifications from various apps, none of them important. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts replaying the moment Steve had mentioned seeing someone inside the apartment. Could I have forgotten to lock the door? Or had someone been inside? The next morning, I woke up with a sense of dread, still unsure of what to believe. I needed to go home. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. I told my friends I was cutting the weekend short and left early, citing work as an excuse. As I drove back to the city, my mind couldn't stop racing. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but my thoughts were trapped in that moment, my door ajar, Steve's voice, and the strange figure he'd seen. When I finally arrived back at my apartment, the first thing I did was check the door. It was locked, just as it should be. There was no sign of forced entry or any disturbance. Still, I felt a sinking feeling in my chest. I grabbed my keys and unlocked the door, stepping inside cautiously. The apartment looked exactly as I had left it, no furniture out of place, no sign of anyone having been there. Yet the air felt heavy, thick with a presence that wasn't there before. I walked through the rooms, checking every corner, the bathroom, the kitchen. Everything seemed normal, but there was one thing that caught my attention. On the kitchen counter, a single item was out of place. A mug that I didn't remember leaving there, its white ceramic surface facing the wall as if someone had purposely set it down that way. I stood frozen, staring at it, trying to figure out if I had been the one to leave it there. But I didn't drink coffee. I never used that mug. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly turned away, feeling the walls close in around me. My thoughts spiraled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside my home after all. But if they had, why hadn't they taken anything? Why had they just left the door open? I checked the security footage one last time, hoping for some kind of explanation. But as I scrolled through the footage, I saw something that made my blood run cold. For a brief moment, just before the door had opened, a shadow seemed to flicker past the camera, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. My breath caught in my throat. It was a figure, too tall and thin to be Steve. The shadow wasn't anyone I recognized. I closed the app, my fingers trembling. My heart was racing again, the sense of unease now consuming me entirely. It was clear someone had been here, and they weren't just looking for something, they had been watching me. Story 23. I stood by the elevator, staring at the glowing buttons above the door, my mind lost in thought. The office building was nearly empty at this hour, and the silence of the lobby seemed to stretch on forever. It was the usual end to my late shift, the quiet that came with the buildings winding down. I was eager to get home, but I had to wait for the elevator to take me down to the parking garage. Just as I was about to check my phone, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, slightly startled, to see a man walking toward the elevator. He was tall, with dark hair, wearing a well-fitted suit. His presence was unexpected in the near-empty lobby, and the way he moved toward me felt a bit too deliberate. I shifted uncomfortably, giving him a polite nod, but he didn't seem to notice. He stopped a little too close to me, the space between us suddenly feeling too small. The man didn't speak at first, but I could feel his gaze. His eyes were unsettlingly calm, as though he was studying me from head to toe. I looked away, trying to avoid his stare, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air around us felt heavier, and I took a small step to the side, hoping to put some distance between us. But he matched my movement, stepping closer again, almost as if he was trying to corner me. The elevator doors didn't open, and the man smiled a wide, unnerving grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ladies first," he said, his voice smooth but with an edge that sent a shiver down my spine. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to react. Something about his demeanor made the offer feel like a trap, not a courtesy. The last thing I wanted to do was step into that elevator with him, but I didn't want to be rude, either. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the elevator button as I tried to decide whether to get in. My heart was racing, and I could feel the tension building in the pit of my stomach. The elevator, a familiar and mundane part of my routine, suddenly felt ominous. I glanced at the man again, and he was still smiling, his expression almost too eager, too forced. He didn't move to step inside, just stood there, watching me. I looked back at the elevator, its steel doors wide open, waiting for me. It was just a ride down. I thought, nothing to be afraid of. But the unease wouldn't leave me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I weighed my options. What if he followed me in? What if something worse happened? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Without thinking, I shook my head and took a step back. "I'll wait for the next one," I said, my voice unsteady. The man's smile faltered just for a split second before it returned, even wider than before. It wasn't a reassuring smile. It was as if he had expected me to refuse, as if that was part of whatever strange game he was playing. He didn't speak again. Instead, he simply stood there, still as a statue, watching me. I could feel his eyes on me, like a weight pressing against my back. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, and the silence between us was suffocating. I felt trapped in that moment, unable to escape without making a scene, but unwilling to get into the elevator with him. Finally, the elevator doors closed, the soft ding marking the end of the uncomfortable encounter. The man didn't move, still standing by the closed elevator. I took a deep breath and glanced around, hoping someone else would come through the lobby and break the tension. But there was no one. The building was still as ever, and the only sound was the faint hum of the elevator's machinery. The seconds passed, but the feeling of unease lingered. I was just about to turn away when the elevator doors suddenly opened again, this time with no warning. I froze. It didn't make any sense. The elevator had just closed, and now it was opening again on its own, with no one inside. I stared at the empty space, my mind racing. I hadn't heard the elevator move, but now it was as if the man had simply vanished. I glanced at the spot where he had been standing moments before, but he was gone. It was as if he had never been there at all. I blinked, trying to process what had just happened, but the confusion only deepened. I could feel my chest tightening, a mix of fear and disbelief pooling inside me. I should have gotten on the elevator when I had the chance. I should have just ignored the strange encounter. But now I was left with the unsettling question: where had he gone? The elevator doors stayed open for a few moments, as if waiting for me to step in. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't get in, not after what had just happened. I looked down the hallway, hoping to see anyone who could explain what was going on. But there was nothing. No one. The elevator doors finally closed again, and I let out a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. I quickly turned and walked toward the stairs, not wanting to risk being near the elevator any longer. My heart was still pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. The building, which had always felt so familiar, now seemed foreign, as if I didn't belong there anymore. I took the stairs down to the parking garage, my footsteps echoing in the quiet stairwell. The whole time I couldn't shake the image of the man's smile from my mind, the unnerving stillness of his presence. I knew one thing for sure: I would never look at that elevator the same way again. It was as if whatever had happened that night wasn't just an encounter, it was a warning. Story 24. I had arrived at the bed and breakfast after a long day of travel, the cozy inn tucked away in a quiet corner of the town. The owner, a woman named Edith, greeted me with a wide smile and an enthusiasm that seemed a little too eager for someone running a small business. Her hospitality was overwhelming, and while I appreciated the kindness, Something about the way she hovered around me felt unsettling. She insisted on showing me every nook and cranny of the place, from the old, creaky staircase to the floral patterned rooms, each more meticulously decorated than the last. Once I settled into my room, I couldn't help but notice the antique furnishings. The bed was soft and the atmosphere was quiet, yet there was something off about it. The wallpaper, with its faded roses and intricate designs, gave the room a sense of age, almost as if it had been stuck in time. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I made a mental note to explore the place more the next day. As night fell, the house seemed to grow quieter. The faint creaks of the wooden floorboards beneath me were the only sounds I could hear. The soft ticking of a clock somewhere in the distance was the only other noise in the room. I tried to relax, but a sense of unease settled in. Maybe it was the way Edith had watched me earlier, or perhaps it was the isolation of the old house, but my mind couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I eventually drifted into a restless sleep, the kind where your mind is never fully at ease. The night passed in a haze of half-dreams, each one more strange than the last. I remember hearing faint whispers, though I couldn't make out the words. It felt as though the house itself was alive, breathing in sync with me. I shook off the thoughts, blaming it on exhaustion, but as the night wore on, the unease only deepened. Around 2 a.m., I was suddenly jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of a doorknob turning. At first, I thought it was just a dream, but then it happened again. The soft clicking of the brass doorknob echoed through the silence of the room. My heart skipped a beat, and I held my breath, listening intently. The door was locked, or at least, I thought it was. I was sure I had locked it when I first entered. But the turning of the knob persisted, slow and deliberate, as if someone was testing it, checking if it was secure. I sat up in bed, my pulse quickening as I strained to hear anything beyond the turning doorknob. There was no one on the other side. I was certain of it, but the sound didn't stop. It continued, faint but insistent, as if someone was trying to gain entry without making any noise. I felt a cold sweat bead on the back of my neck, and for a moment, I questioned whether I was still dreaming. But the fear that coursed through me told me otherwise. This was real. I grabbed the lamp from the bedside table and crept to the door, my feet barely making a sound on the old wooden floor. The doorknob continued to turn, but it didn't move. Whoever or whatever was on the other side didn't seem interested in entering. They were just toying with me. I couldn't explain why I felt that way, but the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. I put my ear to the door, trying to catch any sound, any hint of movement. Nothing. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the door as I grabbed my phone. I debated whether I should call the police, but I quickly dismissed the idea. It wasn't like anything had actually happened. There was no one outside the door, and I had no evidence that anything was wrong. Still, the sensation of being watched lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Just then, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving away from my door, fading into the distance. It was as though someone had simply walked off, leaving me in the silence of my own thoughts. I stood there frozen, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. The only sound was the faint rustle of the curtains as a breeze filtered through the room. I tried to convince myself it had been a figment of my imagination, a trick played on me by the house's creaky old bones. The next morning I ventured downstairs, trying to shake off the unsettling experience from the night before. Edith was there, as chipper as ever, offering me coffee and an assortment of pastries. She didn't seem to notice that I was on edge, or if she did, she didn't acknowledge it. Her overly friendly demeanor was both comforting and unnerving at the same time. I asked her if anything unusual had happened the night before, but she simply smiled and shook her head. "Just the usual, dear. You're the only one staying here, after all." Her words struck me, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settle back in. I hadn't seen anyone else last night, but I couldn't ignore what had happened. The sound of the doorknob turning, the footsteps that had followed it all felt too real. But Edith didn't seem to acknowledge anything unusual. Her smile never wavered, and she went on about her day as if nothing had happened. As I left the bed and breakfast later that afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind. The house, the owner, and the strange events of the night were all still with me, lingering in the back of my mind. I tried to tell myself it had been a fluke, just a strange coincidence, but deep down I knew it wasn't. There was something wrong with that place, and I had a feeling I would never truly know what it was. Story 25. I had been driving for hours, desperate to get some rest after a long stretch of road. I stopped at a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of town. The neon sign flickered in the darkness, casting an eerie red glow over the empty parking lot. It wasn't the kind of place I would usually choose, but I was too tired to be picky. The inside of the room smelled musty, like old furniture and stale air. The bed was covered in a faded floral duvet, and the carpet was stained in places. I didn't care, I just wanted to sleep. After locking the door, I tossed my bags on the bed and walked into the bathroom to freshen up. As I washed my hands, I noticed a small hole in the wall near the corner of the bathroom. It was odd it wasn't big, just the size of a pencil eraser, but it looked out of place. My curiosity got the best of me. I leaned closer to the hole, squinting to see if I could make out anything on the other side. The dim light made it difficult to see much, but I could have sworn there was something strange about the hole, like it wasn't just a random crack. I pushed my face closer, careful not to press too hard on the wall. For a moment, I saw nothing but darkness on the other side. Then, just as I was about to pull away, I saw it. A glint of light reflected off something, and then a pair of eyes appeared. They were staring directly at me, unblinking and unmoving. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It took a moment for me to process what I was seeing, and then panic surged through me. Someone was watching me. I stepped back from the hole, my heart racing. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, but the eyes remained in my mind, vivid and unsettling. What were they doing on the other side? And why hadn't I noticed the hole when I first entered the room? The longer I thought about it, the more paranoid I became. There had to be a logical explanation, but I couldn't find one. I walked back into the main part of the room, pacing nervously. My mind was racing with questions I couldn't answer. Was someone hiding behind the wall? Or was it some kind of weird coincidence? The thought that someone could be spying on me made me feel sick to my stomach. I considered leaving, but it was late, and the idea of finding another place to stay felt like too much effort. The room was unnervingly quiet. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it lingered, like a weight pressing down on me. After a few minutes, I went back to the bathroom, standing a few feet away from the hole, but not daring to get any closer. My curiosity was eating at me, but I wasn't sure I wanted to know what lay beyond that small crack. Still, I had to look. Slowly, I approached the wall once again. I leaned in, heart pounding in my chest. The hole was small, but I could still make out the faint outline of something or someone on the other side. The eyes were gone now, but I could still feel their presence, lingering in the air. I held my breath, afraid to make a sound, afraid that whatever was on the other side would hear me. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or maybe someone was hiding, watching every move I made. Just as I was about to turn away, I heard a sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A whisper. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't make out the words, but I could tell it was directed at me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt frozen in place. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, and then it stopped abruptly. I pulled away from the wall, my body trembling with fear. I turned on my heels and rushed back into the main room, pacing back and forth, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind was a whirlwind of questions and possibilities, none of which made any sense. Who could be on the other side of the wall? Why were they watching me? And why had they been so quiet before? The more I thought about it, the more I began to feel trapped, like the walls were closing in on me. I checked the door, locking it again just to be sure. I paced the room for what felt like hours, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence was deafening, but it was also unsettling. It felt like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But what? I couldn't explain the sense of dread that had settled over me. Eventually, I decided I needed to get some sleep, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the eyes staring at me through that hole. I tried to ignore it, to push it out of my mind, but I couldn't. The image of those eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, haunted me. I kept hearing that whisper, too, as if it was echoing in my ears, taunting me. The rest of the night passed in a haze of restlessness and fear. Every sound, every shift in the air made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching, still waiting. But by the time the sun began to rise, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care that it was early, or that I hadn't slept. I needed to get out of that motel before whatever was behind that wall decided to make itself known. I grabbed my things, rushed out of the room, and checked out as quickly as I could. The whole time I felt like I was being followed, like something was just behind me, lurking in the shadows. As I drove away from the motel, I glanced back in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the window, watching me. But there was nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. Even now, I sometimes wonder about that hole in the wall, about the eyes that stared back at me from the darkness. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever was on the other side is still out there, waiting for someone else to stumble upon the motel room. Story 26. The mountain road stretched out before me, winding through dense trees and steep cliffs. The sky had started to darken as the sun sank behind the peaks, casting long shadows over the road. I was already running behind on my trip, and the last thing I needed was car trouble. But that's exactly what I got. My engine sputtered, then died, and the car rolled to a slow stop. I tried to restart it, but nothing happened. I turned the key again, but all I got was a clicking sound. Panic crept into my chest. The road was deserted. I hadn't passed another vehicle for miles, and there was no sign of any town or gas station nearby. I looked down at my phone, hoping for a signal, but it showed only a no-service message. Great. Stranded in the mountains with no way to contact anyone. I got out of the car, shutting the door behind me and trying to think through my options. I could try to walk back down the road, but I had no idea how far I had traveled or where I might find help. I walked to the front of my car, popping the hood to check the engine, but everything looked normal. I had no mechanical skills, so I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I figured it couldn't hurt to try something. After a few minutes of poking around, I gave up and walked back to the driver's side to sit and think. That's when I heard a low hum, followed by the rumble of a truck engine. I turned my head, squinting into the dimming light, and saw a truck pulling slowly behind me. It was big, dark, and rusted, the headlights cutting through the twilight like twin spotlights. I couldn't make out the driver's face, but the truck seemed to be moving unnaturally slow, as if it were creeping up on me. My stomach tightened, and a chill ran down my spine. The truck didn't stop, though. It didn't pull up beside me or roll down the window to ask if I needed help. It simply idled behind my car, the engine humming steadily. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Was the driver waiting for me to approach? I glanced at my phone again, but the lack of service only deepened my sense of isolation. I debated getting back into my car and locking the doors, but something held me there, rooted to the spot. The truck was a good 10 feet behind my car now, and I could barely see the driver's silhouette through the tinted windows. No one else had been on this road for hours, and it seemed strange that a truck would show up just when I was stranded. What if it was someone looking to take advantage of the situation? I didn't have any weapons, and I didn't know the first thing about defending myself in this kind of situation. After what felt like an eternity, the truck's engine suddenly cut off, and the sound of silence filled the air. My breath caught in my throat as I waited, wondering if the driver would get out. But nothing happened. I hesitated, then cautiously stepped closer to my car, watching the truck. The headlights were still on, and the taillights glowed a faint red. The truck was so still now that it almost seemed like a part of the landscape itself, quiet, unmoving, and unnervingly patient. I glanced up at the road ahead, considering my options again. I had no idea how far I was from the nearest help, and walking would mean leaving my car behind. But staying here didn't feel much better. I felt the weight of the decision pressing on me, but before I could act, the truck's engine roared back to life, and the vehicle slowly began to roll forward again. My heart skipped a beat. The truck wasn't leaving, it was coming closer. It moved at a sluggish pace, as if the driver were deliberately trying to get as close to me as possible without fully committing. I instinctively took a step back toward my car, my eyes locked on the headlights that grew brighter with each passing second. I wanted to get inside, lock the doors, and just drive away. But my car wouldn't start. As the truck stopped behind me, I could now see the figure of the driver in the front seat. He was sitting still, hands resting on the wheel, his face obscured by shadow. I didn't know what to do. Should I approach him? Ask for help? Or should I call the police, even though I couldn't get a signal? I opened the door to my car and slid back into the driver's seat, trying to steady my shaking hands. I put the key in the ignition and tried again. The engine sputtered, coughed, and stalled. Nothing. I tried again, but the truck was still there, idling behind me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for something. Maybe it was just me being paranoid, but it felt like the truck was observing me, gauging my next move. I glanced at my rearview mirror, trying to read the situation. The truck's headlights were so bright that they almost blinded me. In the reflection, I thought I saw the driver shift slightly in his seat, but I couldn't be sure. It was as though the man, if it was a man, was just waiting for me to make the first move. But I wasn't sure what move to make. I didn't trust the situation, and my instincts were screaming at me to drive away, but my car wouldn't cooperate. I finally decided I had to take action. I opened the door and stepped out of the car, trying to appear calm and collected, even though every muscle in my body was tense. The truck's engine revved, and I could feel the weight of the truck behind me, looming, threatening. I took a deep breath and walked toward the truck, my hand reaching for my pocket where I kept my phone. Before I could get closer, the truck suddenly lurched forward and sped past me, its tires kicking up gravel as it disappeared into the fading light. I stood frozen in the road, staring after it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The truck was gone, but the unease remained heavy in the air. What had just happened? Had it been a warning, or something worse? I stood there for a long time, my heart still racing. Eventually, I managed to get my car started, the engine coughing to life after several tries. But even as I drove away, the image of that truck, idling in the darkness, stayed with me, a reminder of how easily things could go wrong in the mountains with no one around to help. Story 27. The bar was crowded, the hum of conversations mixing with the clink of glass and the occasional laughter from a table of friends celebrating. I had only stepped away for a moment, just long enough to use the restroom and grab my phone from the counter. My drink, a gin and tonic, sat untouched on the table, swirling in its glass as the ice melted slowly, almost like it was waiting for me. I didn't think anything of it when I left it there. It was a busy bar, and I had seen the bartender just a few minutes before. When I returned, the first thing I noticed was that the drink had been moved. It wasn't where I had left it, now sitting slightly to the side, and the ice had melted a little more than I expected. It was odd, but I assumed the bar staff had moved it for some reason. However, what really struck me was the man sitting just a few feet away from my seat, his eyes fixed on me as I approached the table. His smile was wide, too wide, as though he knew something I didn't. "You should be careful," he said, his voice low but clear as I reached for my drink. "I wouldn't drink that if I were you." His words sent an immediate chill down my spine. I paused, my hand hovering over the glass, and turned to look at him more closely. He was older, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, with sharp features and a casual demeanor that seemed out of place for the seriousness of his tone. His eyes didn't leave mine, his smile still plastered across his face, though there was something unsettling about it. It wasn't the kind of smile someone gives when they're joking around with a stranger. It was something darker, more predatory. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease that his words had caused. "What do you mean?" I asked, forcing a smile of my own, though my heart was beating faster now. He shrugged, leaning back in his seat, but his eyes never left me. "Nothing, really," he said, his tone too casual. "Just that it's not a good idea to drink something you leave unattended for too long." He raised his glass to his lips, taking a sip, his gaze still locked on me. You never know who's been around, or what they've put in it. My stomach twisted, and a feeling of dread settled deep inside me. It was a strange thing to say, especially in a place like this, where everyone seemed to be minding their own business. I looked back at my drink, my mind racing. Had someone tampered with it? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but his warning kept echoing in my mind. I hadn't seen anyone come near my drink while I was away, but then again I hadn't been paying much attention. I took a step back, unsure of what to do next. Part of me wanted to just leave, to walk out of the bar and never look back. But another part of me was too curious, too unsettled by the man's behavior to ignore it. I glanced at the bartender, who was busy mixing drinks for a group at the end of the bar. No one else seemed to have noticed the interaction, and the usual buzz of the place continued uninterrupted. The man must have sensed my hesitation, because he smiled again, this time more knowingly. "I'm not saying someone poisoned it," he said, his voice now a little quieter, almost like he was confiding in me. "But it's not uncommon, you know. People do strange things when they think no one is watching." I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being played, but at the same time I couldn't afford to dismiss his words entirely. What if he was telling the truth? What if someone had slipped something into my drink while I wasn't looking? It would explain his strange behavior, his unnerving warning. But why was he telling me this? What did he want from me? Are you saying someone put something in my drink? I asked cautiously, my voice shaky as I finally asked the question I had been avoiding. He tilted his head slightly, studying me. "I'm not saying anything," he replied with a shrug, his smile never wavering. "I'm just saying you should be careful. It's always better to be safe than sorry." At that moment, I didn't know whether to be angry, scared, or just completely confused. I took a step back from the table, my eyes still on him, trying to figure out what he wanted. I wasn't about to drink the gin and tonic now, not after what he had said. But I also wasn't sure if I should confront him, ask him why he'd bothered to warn me. Part of me felt like I should just walk away, but another part of me felt an inexplicable need to know more. "You didn't have to warn me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But thanks, I guess." He gave a slow nod, his smile never faltering. "No problem. You seem like someone who likes to play it safe." I wasn't sure what to make of that. He was right. Of course, I wasn't the type to take risks, especially when it came to my safety. But the whole situation had left me unsettled. I quickly glanced around the bar again, hoping to find someone else who might have noticed the strange exchange. But everyone seemed absorbed in their own conversations, oblivious to what was happening at my table. "Don't drink it," he said once more, his voice firm now, as if he was trying to get a point across. I nodded, my heart racing. "I won't," I said, the words coming out more firmly than I expected. Without another word, I grabbed my purse and turned away from the table, my mind still racing. I didn't even look back as I walked out of the bar and into the cool night air, where I could finally breathe again. I don't know what the man wanted from me, or if he had been trying to help or just messing with me. But as I walked down the street toward my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something terrible, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And for the rest of the night, I couldn't stop wondering what if I had drunk the damn thing. Story 28. It was a regular Tuesday afternoon when I stepped outside the store, ready for a quick break. The sun was shining and the parking lot was half empty, which was unusual for this time of day. I had been working the register for a few hours and I needed a breather. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out to check a text from a friend, distracted for a moment by the conversation. As I looked down at my screen, a van slowly pulled up beside me. I glanced up, not paying much attention at first, assuming it was just another delivery or someone looking for a spot. The van was an older model, dark green, with faded paint on the side, blending in with the other vehicles in the lot. But then something caught my eye. The side door of the van slid open just a crack. I couldn't see inside, but the movement made my stomach tighten. I felt a strange, prickling sensation at the back of my neck. There was something off about the way the door had opened, as if someone was waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself it was just an ordinary delivery or someone looking to park. But my instincts told me otherwise. I looked around the parking lot, but no one was near me. It was just me and the van now. I took a few steps back, my feet suddenly feeling heavy. The van's engine hummed softly and the door remained open, just enough to make me feel uncomfortable. I noticed the windows were tinted, and I couldn't make out any details inside. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it just someone trying to rest for a moment? Or was it something more? My gut told me to get away, to move quickly, but I hesitated, frozen for a moment by the uncertainty of the situation. The door of the van opened slightly wider, and I could hear faint shuffling from inside. My heart pounded in my chest as my eyes darted to the entrance of the store, which felt miles away. The sound of footsteps inside the van echoed like a warning. I could feel my palms growing clammy as I turned to face the store, the safe haven only a few feet away. Without thinking, I broke into a run, my shoes slapping against the pavement as I hurried toward the entrance. I didn't dare look back to see if the van was following me. I just knew I had to get inside the store, where it was well lit and filled with people. The door swung open as I reached for the handle, and I rushed in, heart racing, breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Inside, I leaned against the door for a moment, trying to steady myself. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. The store was quiet, and the regular hum of the fluorescent lights overhead offered little comfort. My mind raced with questions. What had that van been doing? Who had been inside? I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I glanced around the store, hoping to distract myself from the sense of paranoia that was beginning to creep over me. Everything seemed normal, shelves stocked with products, a few customers browsing, and the cashier at the counter absorbed in their work. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that I had narrowly avoided something I couldn't quite define. A few minutes passed, and I gathered the courage to approach the counter. I asked the cashier if they'd seen the van pull up outside, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out strained. The cashier looked up briefly from their work and shrugged. I didn't notice anything, they said, turning their attention back to the register. Maybe just someone stopping by. But that answer didn't sit well with me. I could feel the tension still tight in my chest, my pulse still quick. I couldn't stop thinking about the door of the van opening, the way it had just lingered, as if waiting for something. I wasn't sure if I was overthinking it, or if I had actually been in danger, but something told me that van hadn't been there by chance. I spent the next few minutes pacing nervously in the aisles, pretending to browse but not really looking at anything. My eyes kept flicking toward the front windows, watching the parking lot for any sign of movement. The van was still there, parked a few spots down from where it had been earlier. I felt a sense of dread welling up inside me as I wondered if the people inside had noticed me running back into the store. Were they waiting for me to leave, to come back out? Time seemed to crawl, and the once busy parking lot now seemed eerily quiet. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But the thought of that door sliding open again, just a little wider, kept playing over and over in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something bad. When my break ended, I reluctantly left the store and walked back to my car. I kept my eyes on the van as I moved toward my vehicle, but the side door was closed now, and there was no sign of life from inside. Still, I couldn't shake the sense of unease. The van had been too deliberate, too quiet, and I couldn't forget the way it had waited for me to get close before making its move. I got into my car, locked the doors immediately, and started the engine. I glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the van as I pulled out of the parking lot, but it didn't follow me. The strange feeling still lingered in the pit of my stomach, though, and I knew I wouldn't be forgetting the encounter anytime soon. I couldn't help but wonder how different things might have been if I hadn't run inside when I did. Story 29. For weeks, it had been the same routine. I'd be settling in for the night, catching up on a show or reading a book, when I would hear the soft knocking at my back door. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the house settling, but the knocking was too rhythmic, too deliberate to ignore. Each time it would come, like clockwork, just as the last light of the day faded into the dark. I live in a small house at the edge of town, surrounded by a thick patch of trees. The isolation was one of the reasons I had moved there. I preferred the peace and quiet away from the bustle of city life. But after the knocking started, I wasn't sure if I liked being so alone anymore. The house, once comforting and serene, now felt like a trap. I began to check the back door more frequently, peering out the window into the backyard to see if anyone was there. But no one ever was. It started to feel like a game. The knocking would come at random hours, midnight, 2 a.m., sometimes even 4 in the morning. I would jump up from whatever I was doing and rush to the window, only to be greeted by darkness. The backyard was always empty, just the sway of trees in the breeze, the moonlight casting long shadows. I checked the camera system in the house, convinced I had missed something. The footage would always show an empty yard, no one approaching the back door. No movement, just the same quiet stillness. After several nights of this strange pattern, I began to grow paranoid. I installed extra cameras around the house, hoping to catch whoever was playing this game. I even set up motion sensors around the back porch and door, but nothing ever triggered them. I kept hearing the knocking, but when I checked, it was always the same. An empty yard, an empty doorstep, nothing more. I tried to convince myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, or perhaps the trees outside making sounds in the wind, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night I decided to stay up and wait. I had enough of hearing the knocking without knowing what was behind it. I sat in the dim light of my living room, my eyes flicking nervously to the clock. As the hours passed, I felt the weight of silence pressing down on me, but nothing happened. No knocking. No sounds from the back door. I was beginning to relax when suddenly the knock came. It was louder this time, as though it had been waiting for me to finally pay attention. My heart raced as I stood up, my legs shaky as I moved toward the back door. I opened the blinds and looked out into the dark yard, but once again, no one was there. I checked the camera footage in real time, hoping for a clue. As I rewound the footage to the exact time of the knock, my stomach dropped. The camera showed nothing, no person, no movement near the door. The footage was as empty as it always was. But when I rewound it a bit further, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the seconds before the knocking began, there was a faint flicker in the yard. The motion sensor lights had briefly turned on, only for a moment, just enough to cast a shadow in the corner of the screen. I tried to tell myself it was just a glitch, that maybe an animal had brushed against the sensor, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next few nights were a blur of dread. I could hear the knocking coming at odd hours, sometimes a few minutes after I'd sit down, sometimes when I was trying to fall asleep. Each time I would rush to check the camera feed, only to find the same eerie emptiness. It felt like I was going mad, trapped in a loop of anticipation and disappointment. I decided to take action. One night I turned off all the lights in the house and sat in complete darkness, waiting. My heart thudded in my chest as the house seemed to settle around me. There was no knocking for a long time, and I began to wonder if perhaps this was all in my head. Maybe I was just hearing things, maybe it was some trick of the mind. But then, just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, I heard it again, the familiar knocking at the back door. This time I didn't rush to check the camera or peek out the window. I stood absolutely still, waiting for the knock to come again. And it did. Softly, 3 knocks spaced evenly apart. I felt my pulse quicken, but I remained frozen, not knowing what to do. After a few moments, I finally walked cautiously toward the door, my hands trembling. My footfalls echoed in the stillness as I moved to the back window, hesitating for a long time before pulling the blinds open. What I saw took my breath away. The yard was still empty, the trees casting long shadows in the moonlight, the ground undisturbed. But just as my mind was starting to convince me that this was another trick of my eyes, something shifted in the shadows. I couldn't see what it was, but I knew it was there. The outline of a figure tall, but blurred, standing at the edge of the trees. I could barely make it out, but there was something undeniably unsettling about it. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, as though waiting for me to look. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming out in ragged gasps. I quickly shut the blinds, but I knew that whatever I had seen was real. The knocking had stopped, but the figure remained in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been there all along, just out of view. I didn't sleep that night. In fact, I didn't sleep for several nights after that. The knocking, the shadow, the feeling of being watched, it had all become too much. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed up a bag and stayed at a friend's house, hoping to escape the strange events that had haunted me. I turned off the cameras, the motion sensors, and the lights before I left. But something told me that the knocking would continue. Whatever it was that had been visiting me at night, it hadn't finished with me yet. I just hoped I would never hear it again. Story 30. I arrived at the hotel late in the evening, exhausted after a long day of travel. The lobby was quiet, lit only by the soft glow of a few lamps. The receptionist, an older woman with tired eyes, handed me the key without much conversation. I made my way to the room, barely noticing the flickering hallway lights as I passed by them. It had been a long journey, and I was eager to relax and unwind for the night. The room was clean and smelled faintly of disinfectant, typical for a place like this. I tossed my suitcase onto the bed and started to unpack, glad to finally have some time to myself. As I opened the nightstand drawer to place my phone and wallet inside, something caught my eye. A folded piece of paper, tucked into the corner of the drawer. I pulled it out, curious, and unfolded it carefully. The message inside was short but alarming. Get out now. Do not stay the night. At first I thought it was a prank, maybe a joke from a previous guest or something meant to unsettle me. I chuckled nervously to myself, folding the note back up and putting it aside. It was probably nothing. I glanced around the room, noticing the old wallpaper peeling slightly in the corners and the creaking floorboards beneath my feet. But nothing seemed overtly strange, aside from the note. Still, an uneasy feeling settled in my chest, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. I tried to shrug it off, reminding myself that it was probably just a harmless prank. I settled onto the bed, turned on the TV, and tried to focus on something other than the note. But the words kept echoing in my mind, "Do not stay the night." The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. What if it wasn't a joke? What if someone wanted me to leave because there was something dangerous about this place? The thought made my stomach churn, and I looked around the room again, scanning it for any signs of danger. Everything appeared normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stood up, pacing the room, trying to make sense of it. Was it the staff who left the note? Maybe they had a reason for wanting me to leave. Or maybe it was someone else, someone who had stayed in the room before. I went to the door and checked the lock, making sure it was secure. I looked out the window, but the view was obscured by the heavy curtains. The street below was dimly lit, with few cars passing by. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, yet my gut told me something wasn't right. I thought about leaving, packing my things and checking into another hotel. But it was late, and I was tired. Besides, I had already paid for the room, and I hated the idea of giving in to whatever fear this note had stirred in me. I decided to stay, at least for a little while longer, and see if anything strange happened. The note could have been written by anyone, maybe someone just trying to mess with me. I tried to relax again, but the discomfort lingered. The hours seemed to drag on, and every small sound made me jump. The air felt thick, heavy, as if something unseen was pressing down on me. The room, once so ordinary, now felt claustrophobic, its walls closing in. My mind raced with possibilities. Was I being paranoid, or was there something truly sinister going on here? Around midnight, I heard a noise, soft, almost imperceptible at first. I froze, listening intently. It came again, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails running lightly across the door. My heart skipped a beat, and I rushed to the door, peeking through the peephole. There was no one in the hallway. Just shadows stretched long by the dim light from the flickering overhead lamp. I exhaled, relieved, and stepped away from the door. But the feeling of dread refused to leave. I sat on the bed, staring at the door, wondering if I should leave. But then the scratching came again, louder this time, more persistent. I jumped to my feet, my pulse quickening. What was that? I couldn't be sure, but it sounded like something or someone was on the other side of the door, scraping at it, trying to get in. I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the room for something to protect myself with. The room was silent for a moment, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I felt trapped, like I couldn't leave even if I wanted to. The windows were locked, the door was shut tight, but the unsettling sensation wouldn't go away. I thought about calling the front desk, but I was afraid of what I might hear if I did. What if they knew more than they were letting on? What if they were somehow involved in this strange, eerie situation? I paced the room again, my mind racing, trying to think of what to do next. Should I confront whatever was behind that door? Should I run? I could leave. But the note had said to get out now. Maybe leaving wasn't the solution, maybe it was exactly what they wanted. I needed to get out of this hotel, but my fear was rooted in something deeper, something I couldn't understand. Then, as if to confirm my worst fears, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, and heavy. They were coming closer, and the door to my room creaked as if someone was standing just outside, waiting. My breath caught in my throat, and I stood frozen in place. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I looked down at the note again, its message now feeling like a warning, not a joke. Get out now. Do not stay the night. I knew that I had to leave. No matter what was waiting outside that door, I couldn't stay. I grabbed my things in a frenzy, my hands trembling, and bolted out of the room, heart pounding. I didn't look back as I ran down the stairs and out into the cold night air, away from whatever haunted that place. I never found out who left the note or why, but I knew one thing for sure. I'd never stay in that hotel again.